Okay, folks, we are live. So for those listening at home, welcome to the Dungeon Musings YouTube channel. My name is Kevin Madison, and I will be your friendly, guide to D&D 4th Edition today. Because today I'm going to... at the time of recording, it is Christmas Eve on 2020, and 2020 being the bit of a dumpster fire of a year that everyone has been describing it. And I mean, I don't mean to be flippant. It's been a terrible, terrible year for a lot of folks, myself included. Though I... have found that it has coincided with my midlife crisis, which is why I currently am sporting this lovely ponytail, which I haven't had in about 20 or 25 years. But in part of that, I have recently taken a dive back into one of my favorite editions of Dungeons & Dragons. That's the 4th edition of D&D. And 4th edition is kind of it's the kind of redheaded stepchild of the Dungeons and Dragons brand, but it's also seen in recent years, now that 5th edition is out and has had some time to kind of populate the play space, we've seen a fair amount of people who have been coming back to 4th edition, either for the first time to see what it's all about, or to to look back on good memories they had with the game. And I've seen, at the time of recording, there are a couple of other videos that are out there that provide kind of like a review of 4th edition, and I don't think that any of them are really in good faith. I think that they are presented with a very specific axe to grind, and it's with the amount of fun that I've had with 4th edition back in the day, I figured that it might be worth doing an overview of the game as well. So that's what this video is. Now, that's not to say that I want to just make a video that is all positive, that is just, this is why it's a great game. I don't think 4th edition is for everyone. It is a very different game from Dungeons & Dragons, from basically every other version of Dungeons & Dragons. And to think that it's just, it's going to be very much like 3rd, or very much like 4th, or very much like AD&D, and then play the game, I think that you're just setting yourself up for a bit of disappointment. But that's not to say that there's not a terrific game there, and that there's not some similarities and some commonalities between 4th edition and all the other versions of D&D. What I intend to do today is have a conversation with you about 4th edition in general, and I mean the entire 3 or so year lifespan of the game. For those who aren't familiar with 4th edition, then 4th edition is the edition that was published at the end of the life cycle of the OGL, or Open Game License, third 3.5 version of Dungeons & Dragons. And it came out in June of 2008, is when the original Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide. So here we go. Player's Handbook. We'll start with our visual aids right away. The Dungeon Master's Guide, and the first monster manual for 4th edition. The game saw a soft relaunch in 2010. In September 2010, the Essentials line came out, but to be honest, there was a bit of a redirection or a adjustment of the course of the game in around 2009, late 2009 as well. So the game itself, even as an academic observation or analysis of role-playing game history, it's neat seeing how the game had a shift of course a couple of times trying to get its footing. And then the game, of course, was dead by January 2012 with the announcement of the D&D Next playtest, and that there was going to be a 5th edition of the game. There are a ton of products that came out, and a wide variety of different products that came out during the life cycle of the game. And I'm going to cover as many of them as I can in today's video as well, too. So maybe first what we'll start with is the order that that we're going to be structuring things, how our conversation is going to go here. First off, I'm going to talk about my bias, my own personal bias on this, because obviously I'm a fan of the game. I mentioned that already. And we actually recently went back to the game. The time of recording, about 2 months ago or a month ago or so, we actually reran the a four-part adventure using 4th edition on our YouTube channel to, for one, refresh my memory about how the game works, and also to really get a look back at it, because I haven't run 4th for, I think, 8 years now. Like really since the game died, I never really went back to it. I ran a couple of sessions at one point about 4 years ago, but that died out. It was just it did not work out, and not for the system. It was really just there was other issues with it. But that's my perspective. Is that my bias? Obviously, is that I am a fan of the game. I'm going to try and not just shower praises. I want to make sure that you. If you are coming to this without knowing about 4th edition or knowing only a little bit, I want to make sure that you can walk away with an understanding of what the game actually is, so you can make a call as to whether or not you think it's a game that you may find worth following up on. I'm also going to talk about the boogeyman and kind of expectations with 4th edition. As I said, 4th edition is a very different animal from the other editions of D&D, so it's important to understand going into it what the game actually is, as opposed to what how it, or rather than just finding like a slightly changed version of the other versions of D&D. If you're coming into it, though, depending on the time of record or when you're viewing this video, if you are familiar with, say, Pathfinder 2nd Edition or Starfinder, you might find some things fairly similar. Pathfinder 2 more so. So there will be some common elements, but 4th edition really is its own animal. So we're going to take a look extensively at the core rule books, see what the initial 3 books were, and what sort of they set up for the type of game that was going to be expanded on in the course of the life cycle of the game. We're going to talk about the other books. We're going to talk about some of the settings that were released for it. We're going to talk about some of the expansions and the revisions. As I mentioned, there was 2 different efforts to try and kind of adjust course with the game and tweak the game as it's, patch the game, as they say in the video game industry. I'm going to talk about who this might be for, and I'm going to talk about who might enjoy it. And there is, I'm going to try and talk about that from the perspective of a player as well as a DM. For myself, I know I'm mostly run games, but I actually have played a fair amount of 4th as well. And one thing I'll say as well before we dive in too, if you are new to the channel, then this is going to be a fairly long one. If you're looking for a pithy, short overview of 4th edition, this is probably not going to be for you. I'm likely to go on for a couple of hours and try to really dive deep into the meat, as it were, of 4th edition. Let me just double check and make sure that our stream is going here. And yeah, so let's dive into first my bias. So I started running 4th edition shortly after it was released. At the time, I wasn't running any 3rd edition D&D. I had sort of stalled out on D&D 3rd. I found it too many books, too much crunch, too much planning your character from way ahead. It just 3rd edition was not for me any longer. It's not to say that 3rd edition is a bad game or that I don't enjoy the games that are derived from it, like Pathfinder. It's just that at the time I was running and taking care of other games. But when 4th edition came out, I remember the joy I had picking up my Player's Handbook from for 3rd edition and my Player's Handbook for 2nd edition when I got both of those games. 3rd edition I got from my local gaming store in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and I got my 2nd edition Player's Handbook at a gaming convention in Winnipeg, Manitoba as well. So I really wanted to go in and snag, the books when they were new. And at the time of release, you could get all 3 books in a lovely slipcase as well, too. I can't remember how it was with 2nd edition, but with 3rd, they staggered the releases. So you got the Player's Handbook, and then a month or 2 later, the DMG came out, and then the Monster Manual came out last. And in the first printing of the Player's Handbook, it kind of comically had a bunch of monsters printed in the back as well. But for 4th, I guess they learned their lesson from that, so they released everything at once. So you were able to get access to all 3 games. And I got it, and my first impression of D&D 4th was not great. And part of the reason is because if you're familiar with 3rd edition had this design decision where they made these really, like, the pages inside had this really ochre or like kind of old-aged paper kind of look to it. There was spattering on it. There was these red kind of like, almost like faux metal clasps on the outside of the thing, or at least the design of them. And then I opened up my Player's Handbook for 4th, and what I see is this garish, all white, with lots of colors to accent powers and stuff. And to be honest, I didn't know what to make of it. I read it through, and I couldn't figure out why this would be fun, like why you would run this instead of other games. And I'm really glad that Wizards decided to release a series of podcasts to support it, because they had the guys from the Penny Arcade and PvP Online comic strips play the game. And when I heard them play, it kind of clicked to me like, oh, this is what this game is. And I immediately recognized many of the things that I loved about World of Warcraft. At the time the game released, World of Warcraft was a massively popular video game with millions and millions of subscribers. And what Wizards had decided to do is take design cues from that and figure out how to design versions of Dungeons & Dragons that would appeal to many of the or take some of the really interesting and fun design decisions from 4th edition, and then, or from the 4th edition, from World of Warcraft, and apply those in other multiplayer, massive multiplayer online games, and apply them to the video game. And some of those things are like enforced teamwork, the RNG kind of like getting loot, reward thing, and constantly seeing improvement in loot, having access to different powers, and also a game that would play, at the time, the game was designed to be played online. It was, the hope was that you were going to get a virtual tabletop or product that was going to be released alongside the 4th edition, and that you'd be able to just hop on and play on that. And they've got, in the back of the player's handbook, they had ads for this stuff. They also released a character builder as well, too. I don't remember if the character builder came out at the time of the original books or whether it was rolled out later. I think it was later, because there were some issues with some of the plans with 4th edition over the course of the game. But in any event, that's what that's when the book came out, and I ran 4th edition after hearing how it could be played. I started running it then, and I didn't stop until the game died, until 5th edition. The announcement for 5th edition came out. I ran until my most recent dalliance with Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition. For those who are regular viewers, we play a lot of that on the channel. 4th edition was the game I played, edition of the game I ran the most. We played, like 2 times a weekend at times. And we had a series of different campaigns that were on the go, and I played in an ongoing campaign, seeing a character go from, I think he was 1st up until 6th, and it was, and it was a great deal of fun. And there were a lot of things that the game allowed you to do, or introduced as ideas for designing encounters and designing adventures that had not been present in previous games. Again, my bias is I'm a person who ran a lot of this game. I really enjoyed it for when it was, but I did set it aside at a time, and I'm also someone who really liked World of Warcraft. I like the teamwork element of playing raids and dungeons and things like that in World of Warcraft. I'm not a hardcore player, mind you, but I mean, it's just the nature of having like a role and leaning into that and such, like, and having cool powers. I love all that stuff. So, you cannot get around the fact that Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition has a very, very strong influence from massive multiplayer online games. It's often cited as a reason why it's a criticism of it, but I mean, I don't think that's a valid. It's what it is, full stop. If it's not for you, if you don't like having a role-playing game that's going to take that kind of heavy gamist or have that very much gamist presence in the game, where characters will have roles that are optimized for them, and you can, if you play your character towards that role, then you will see more success at the table. There's lots of strategy and tactics you can use on the table as far as use of powers and teamwork. If that's not something if the lessons that are drawn from video games as applied to a role-playing game are things that would just put you off, you're probably not going to enjoy the game. But that's not to say it's a bad game, though. It just means that it's not for you. And it's not for, to be honest, I mean, many folks coming into 4th edition, who were either expecting a continuation of the much looser structure for character roles and things like that in combat from earlier editions. It was the video game lessons were synonymous with a criticism of the game. However, there's a reason that World of Warcraft has been around for so darn long and has, had the the fan base. It doesn't presently have the same fan base it used to, but at the time of the release, there's a reason that so many people were playing that game, is because there was lots of ways that it made for really fun party play. And I, for myself, this is part of my bias of this, I love that. I love the idea that there's defined roles and that players can feel like badasses when they play their characters to suit that role. You know, your character, it effectively gives a tactical spotlight in which their characters can operate. So that's one of the biases. I'm coming into it like that. The expectations you should have is that there are going to be some very strong gamist elements. Lots of stuff is reduced to specific game mechanics, or reduced is maybe not the right word. It is informed by and shaped by game mechanics. So skill challenges we're going to talk about is an innovation that was introduced in 4th edition. And the powers, likewise, and the roles, likewise. Those are all, the skill challenges are not from video games, but the other stuff really is. It's stuff that, and in a roundabout way, the way that you can recognize stuff from previous editions, daily use magic items and things like that, daily use magical powers, weekly use things. Those are, the ideas that video games took from that for cooldowns was then carried over into 4th edition. So it's sort of a game of telephone as far as how the influences go. But what other stuff? Those are the two expectations, I guess. Like, once you've got those in mind and approach 4th edition from that perspective with that idea that this is going to go. And if the video game thing is off-putting to you, I'd suggest that you still at least give it a try, or at least give it a read, because I think that, or at least try it at the table, because it's the thing that is particularly fun about 4th edition is, I'm going to say that the fun is because it's fun. It is not like, and it doesn't play like traditional D&D. It doesn't play like 3rd or 5th or, 2nd or any of the AD&Ds. It is its own animal, but it is an awful lot of fun to play as well, too. Like having the powers you can use. So now that's not to say that there aren't problems with the game, and we're going to talk about that as we go along, too. Or at least I think things that harm the speed of play and add to the complexity that is unnecessary, or maybe not necessary. But in any event, that is the expectation. So with those in mind, let's talk about what's actually in the core rulebook. So just like every other edition of D&D, you get your Player's Handbook, your DMG, and your Monster Manual. Those are your 3 core books. If you've got those 3 books, you don't need anything else to play. You're going to have other options as we go through this conversation. We're going to talk about some of the other ways you can get into 4th edition, but I'm going to save that for a little later in the video. First up, we've got our Player's Handbook. Now, the Player's Handbook that was released initially had 3 types of heroes. And you'll notice that it says on here, Arcane, Divine, and Martial heroes. What 4th edition also did is decided to classify the classes. That's a terrible phrasing, but I take it you understand what I mean. They categorized the classes in 3 different power sources. The power sources were Arcane, Divine, and Martial. So that's one way that your character class is defined from other character classes. The other way that your character class is defined from others is the role that they play. And the roles are, let's see, Defender, which is like a tank. You're the tough person who wants to keep enemies hitting you as much as possible because you got better armor, or better defenses at least, more hit points, and a bigger bucket of what are called healing surges. And we'll talk about those in a moment. The Defender, the Striker, doing damage either in melee or at ranged. The Controller, it has powers that can shift or change the battlefield or affect a number of targets. They don't do as much damage as what single target things do like the Strikers do, but they can hit more things. And we're going to talk about the different kinds of monsters and how that plays into that role being an awful lot of fun to play sometimes. And there's the Leader. And the Leader is effectively the healer class. Every one of the leader classes has a different way of allowing other characters to heal. And one of the design changes with 4th edition was, in most other games, they've changed this in 5th edition because of the lessons they learned in 3rd and carried through to 4th, and then carried forward those ideas into 5th. But the thing that they didn't, that they kind of realized from 3rd and earlier editions of D&D is that if you're playing a healer and the healer needs to be healing a lot throughout the fight, then that's all they're doing, and it's kind of boring to be the healer. I mean, it's in MMOs, that's an important role, and it is kind of fun and dynamic of constantly healing. But they didn't like the idea that, they thought that it could be quite boring if you're just healing. So each of the leaders have healing abilities, but most often they're only a minor action, which is the least of the three kinds of actions that you can take in the game, or on your turn at least in the game. So what it meant was that even though you're playing a leader, you could still do other interesting things. So you were an important part of the sort of the party makeup, but you weren't just stuck spamming a heal over and over again. You still could do really cool stuff. And the combination of your role and your power source would inform what your kind of like the specific neat stuff about your class. And at the time that this came out, there were only, let's see here, there were two leaders, which were the Warlord, which is a brand new class introduced in here, which was a martial leader, and the Cleric. There was also the Fighter, which was a defender. There was a Paladin, which was a defender as well. The Rogue was a striker. The Ranger was a striker. Both of those were from the martial power source as well, too. You may note that in some editions of D&D that the Ranger draws more from like nature and things like that. We'll see sort of where that type of class comes in the Player's Handbook 2. But in this one, we had, so Rangers, Rogues were strikers at close-up. There was a Warlock, which was introduced. Warlock was introduced in 3.5 in one of the, I think, Arcane, or Complete Arcane. But in any event, the Warlock becomes a core class, and that is a ranged striker as well, too. The Wizard was the only controller in this, and I think that's it. I think you had your four classic classes. In addition, you also had so you had your Wizard, your Fighter, Cleric, Rogue. You also had a Warlord. You also had the Warlock and the Ranger. So you had some variety. The races that were available to play in the core rulebook are the ones that are in every. Well, that's not true. So there are ones that are in most versions of D&D. So your humans, elves, half-elves, dwarves, halflings. But then they introduced two other core classes that have gone on to be, or core races that have gone on to be very, very popular, and that's the Dragonborn and the Tiefling. So you had those as a variety. Some people were put out that there weren't gnomes in this, and there weren't half-orcs in this, but what are you going to do? A book has to, there's always got to be stuff that's not in there. And it's interesting that they introduced the Dragonborn and the Tiefling, and I think that, however you might feel about having those two races in your game, they're insanely popular, and if there is a ethos that 4th edition embraces, it's let's do stuff that's fun. And I think that they thought that it was fun to play Dragonborn and to play Tiefling. So, and the other interesting race that was added in as well is the Eladrin. And the Eladrin are effectively the same type of race that would be considered high elves in other settings, but they had a very distinctive ability called Phase Step. And what that allowed them to do is basically teleport. Every Eladrin had an encounter ability, and we'll talk about what the different kinds of abilities are in a moment, that will allow them to teleport. So there was a lot of very high magic as well, too. The game feels much more suffused with low-level commonplace magic than what other editions do. Magic items come into your life as an adventurer much earlier than they do in other editions. I mean, depending on your DM, I guess, but it's assumed that they will be coming in a lot sooner in this edition than in previous editions. And maybe not quite as much as 3rd, but it's like that. There's a couple other interesting things with the Player's Handbook, like the 3rd edition Player's Handbook in 3.5. Combat rules and how to play the game is in the Player's Handbook. So that's a carryover from the previous 2nd edition, 3rd edition. But one interesting decision is that magic items are all in the Player's Handbook. And the reason that's there is because magic items are one of the One of the most interesting parts, I want to say fun because, but fun is subjective. The use of magic items and the various little abilities that you could get from them were for myself, some of the most fun stuff about 4th edition. There are some, there is a much more ubiquitous presence of magic items, and getting access to them and crafting them is a lot easier in this game than it was in previous editions. Let's talk about some other elements too. The game, in the Player's Handbook with the combat rules, the combat rules are very, very simple. Like, it is, the complexity for this game comes from the use of your powers. Your powers are the things that your character class has access to, starting at, well, let's see here. You've got 3 different kinds of powers that you can draw on. You have at-will powers you can use as many times as you want, sometimes called greens, because the font on the power descriptions were always green. There are encounter abilities, which are red. Encounter abilities can be used once per encounter, and they need you to take a short rest before you recover them. Those who are familiar with 5th edition, or, I take it you understand what a short rest is. Short rests in 4th edition, though, are not 1 hour, they are 5 minutes. If you can catch your breath, you will recharge all of your encounter abilities, so you'll be able to use those red powers again. And the final one is the daily powers. And the daily powers, just like I say, you use them once per day, and you need to complete a long rest, which is, I think, 6 or 8 hours of sleep, and then you're able to recover those. All of the powers, all of the classes have access to those kinds of powers. They are thematic to whatever is appropriate for your class. So, like ranger or fighters aren't throwing fireballs, but the way that what it means is that every single class has some cool, neat stuff they can do, and the at-wills become kind of your default. You certainly can do other things, like a regular attack without taking advantage of one of your powers is called a basic attack. In this book, the basic attack is almost always a suboptimal choice, but the designers over the course of the game decided to shift that a bit and allow more classes to funnel things through basic attacks. If I say basic attack going forward, the best way to think of it is just weapon attack. If you're thinking of it just in terms of like what a weapon attack would be in any other version of D&D, that's what the basic attack is. Your at-wills are just the special tricks that your characters can do. They can be things like a wizard's magic missile. It could be the Eldritch Blast from a warlock. It could be a sly flourish from a rogue. Or it could be a tide of iron from a warrior. And each of the at-wills gives you a small little thing, like maybe it pushes enemies back a bit, or it gives them a penalty on the attacks. It's a little neat things, and more often than not, they synergize nicely with other classes. So there's other ways that you can make use of those abilities. You start off with 2 at-wills, 1 encounter, and 1 daily, at least in these versions of the game, in the basic book. From there, you will gain new feats. You also start with 1 feat, I think, and then you also get another one if you're a human. Skills are... There's no skill points you're spending. You either trained in a skill or not trained in a skill, and training, I believe, gives you +5 to your dice rolls with it, and then you add, I think it's half your level, if I remember correctly. It's either half your level or your full level. But the skill list is dramatically lessened. So there's a lot less skills. Athletics, this is one of the first steps towards consolidating things, so you don't have swim, and jump and whatever else. You just have athletics. This is what the skill list is, right there. So you can see it's quite short. And as you gain levels, you will be making other decisions about your character as well, too. You start off with your class, and then when you hit level 10, you will select a Paragon path. And the Paragon path is something that gives you extra abilities. Think of it like a prestige class, kind of. But what it does is it doesn't replace your class, it augments your class. So you'll get things from your Paragon path that supplement what your class is giving you. And then when you hit level 20, you'll pick an epic path. And the epic path takes you from 20 to 30. D&D 4th goes from level 1 up to level 30. And those 3 tiers of play are called the heroic tier, the paragon tier, and the epic tier. As you go up, you'll gain new powers, you'll replace old powers and things like that, but you hit a point where you cap out for how many different powers you have. It's a lot. Like, it's still a lot of powers. I can't remember offhand what the number is, but high-level play, you have an enormous amount of abilities that you have access to. And to be honest, a lot of things to keep track of. But that's not endemic to 4th edition. That's endemic of every edition of D&D. So it's not necessarily a fault of the edition. It's just the nature of high-level play. But what I will say, in the same way that in, say, 5th edition, they recognize that there's different tiers of play where characters sort of, by gaining access to new abilities, they transition from one type of kind of adventure to another type of adventure, like when you gain Fireball, when you gain access to Teleport, things like that. You see a similar transition between the different tiers as well, too. Characters, once you hit that Paragon tier, characters they're a lot more durable and can dish out a lot more stuff than what they could in the heroic tier. The recommendation from the game was that you sort of structure your story along that thing. Your first kind of arc is your heroic tier, and then you go out into your Paragon tier, and that becomes, bigger, badder heroes in a wider world, and then epic tier is becoming godlike. You really have incredible powers with access to that. Now, the one thing that you may be thinking is, okay, well, hold on. If I'm used to playing a wizard who has access to a whole bunch of different spells, isn't that a lot less than what I had before? And yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. If you're used to playing a caster from any other edition of D&D, you're going to have a much smaller list of abilities than what you were used to. The wizard functions just like every other class. They have access to a certain number of at-wills, a certain number of encounters, and a certain number of dailies. The wizard, though, also gains access to a lot more at-wills that are basically cantrips. And they also have the ability to swap out their encounter and their daily abilities every day. So the way that 4th edition models that kind of that memorization component that's in every other version of D&D, at least official version of D&D, then that's how it gives you that little bit of versatility of swapping out. Every other class can swap powers, but they got to do it at levels. At least, rules is written. So that's a very, very different thing to get used to as well, too. So you've got a selection of powers that you're doing. You've got your class and your role. Your power source and your role. There is multi-classing that is in here, but it's not what it's been in any previous edition or any subsequent edition, with the exception of Pathfinder 2, if you count that as a D&D edition. The way that you gain access to the abilities of another class in 4th edition is by, at least in this version, the initial release, is through the feats. You take feats that slowly give you some abilities and increasingly more abilities of another class. Or you can play a half-elf, and a half-elf gets to pick an at-will from another class at starting level. So it's pretty cool. That, incidentally, was also amended in a later edition, or a later release for this, but in any event, in this version, that's what you get. What else do you need to know here? You also need to know that the combat has been dramatically simplified. The core mechanics of the game embrace simplicity and consistency. Not quite to the degree that 5th edition does, with everything effectively being, except for cover, being advantage. In this, most of your modifiers are going to be 2 or 4, or I think it's 2 or 5. So +2, -2, +5, -5. You do not have saving throws as they've been in any other version of D&D. You do have something called a saving throw. But a saving throw is just a flat roll of a d20, and you want to roll 10 or higher. If you roll 10 or higher, you succeed. If you roll anything else, you fail. It usually relates to things that are like persisting conditions. One of the things that D&D also realized, keeping in mind that the emphasis was on fun, They realized it wasn't a lot of fun for people to be affected by like charm person or hold person or sleep or something like that for, ages. And it wasn't fun to be petrified, by a Medusa, or at least most people didn't find it fun. If you're someone who's more into the old school play and you're not familiar with the channel, we've run over 140 sessions of AD&D second over the past year. So don't get me wrong, I understand the fun and the type of experience that comes from having that kind of hardcore play. But with fourth, it recognized that. So the save is most often used to determine whether or not you're going to be free of some kind of debilitating thing, something that's either doing damage or otherwise negatively affecting your character. Your other abilities, it's not to say that everything is just armor class then. In addition to your armor class, which is a reflection of how hard it is for most adversaries using weapons or physical attacks to injure you in light of your armor and your magical stuff and your dexterity, you also have reflexes, will, and fortitude. And those are not saving throws. They are set numbers. They're defenses. They're defenses that adversaries will roll against. So, if you might have a trap that might roll against your reflexes, or you might have a poison. You were infected with a poison cloud or something like that, or exposed to. And the poison cloud will make an attack roll against your fortitude. Conversely, a lot of your abilities, rather than the players, using something and then seeing if the DM makes a successful roll or saving throw, you make an attack on the adversary's reflexes, will, fortitude, with some other thing. So, and it's neat because a lot of those defenses were often lower than what armor class was, at least sometimes. Or at least they related to the type of thing you were fighting. Like if you're fighting an ogre's probably going to have a really high fortitude defense, but its will defense is probably piss poor. Same thing with its reflex. So if you've got a selection of different things you might want to try, you may see more success with a reflexes attack, say, than you would, or something that targets that, as opposed to the armor class or the fortitude. And it just added a little bit more, texture and nuance to the fight. So you could make some interesting decisions about what things to select. Like you may want to select a variety of different things that target different defenses, so you could, have be useful against a variety of different opponents. Or you might just learn, that, okay, well, most of my stuff attacks if not all, attacks the AC. If I'm attacking something that has other defenses, like a really high AC but low other defenses, I need to help my allies who have those types of attacks because they're probably going to be more successful. So the defenses are a big change. You start at first level with a lot more hit points than you're used to in any other version of D&D. And you also have access to something called healing surges. Now, those who are familiar with 5th edition's hit dice will recognize kind of what these things are. What it is something you expend to gain healing back. And the healing you gain back is equal to your surge value. Your surge value is equal to 1/4 of your hit points rounded down. So every healing surge you spend gives you back 1/4 of your hit points rounded down. And there are different ways to access your healing surges. If you're taking a short rest, you can spend as many of those as you want to recover, just like you can with hit dice in 5th edition. If you are targeted with a healing effect from a leader, then more often than not, what they'll do is they'll let you spend a healing surge, and then you'll get some corollary benefit from that. Clerics will give you some extra healing from it. The warlords, I think they give you a bonus to your defenses. I don't remember. It's been a long time since I ran a warlord. Let's quickly look here. A warlord gives you inspiring word. Oh, no, you also regain additional hit points. I know that later in the life cycle, different things would give you different benefits from it. So, like for instance, the Rune Priest introduced in Player's Handbook 3 you had an option of either giving a bonus to hit, or you gain a little bit of damage reduction. So a little bit of armor that comes after you're healed. And You could also spend them with some magic items, healing potions out of the first kind of, or the player's handbook, and out of the what do you call it, Adventurer's Vault, the first sort of like magic item book that came out for 4th edition. They would also let you tap into that stuff. And then there are certain other ways that you can, where your healing surges come into play, and that's through skill challenges. And we'll talk about that in a moment as well. But I'm trying to think if there's anything else you need to know that's different. Speed is all set out in squares. It's assumed that you're using a battle mat. It's assumed that you're playing online. So your ranges for everything is given in 5-foot squares as opposed to real world distances. Ranged combat in this edition is a lot shorter than what folks are likely used to in other things. A lot of spells have very limited ranges. So if you're used to other editions, or if you're feeling more, if you are looking for that really, immersive kind of like my Eldritch Blast can go, 200, or the fireballs from previous editions where you're going 500 feet plus modifiers for your level. That's not happening in this edition. Everything's going to be usually measured in the range of what can fit on a battle mat. That's just how things are. You may find that stupid, you may find that acceptable, but that's the way it is. The reason for that was to get around the issue of having a very tactical combat, but making sure that it all fits on a battle mat, on a 2x3 table. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else that was of particular interest. Oh, the rituals. Oh, the one thing I'll say about the defenses as well too is that the defenses were calculated for the first time, and I think the only time, because they abandoned this in 5th, but your defenses were calculated on the best of 2 different scores. So your fortitude wasn't just your constitution; it was the best of your constitution or your strength modifier. Reflexes and armor class was the best of your dexterity or intelligence. So wizards didn't get stuck with shit, AC, and have to try and put some stuff into dex in order to avoid getting hit. And will was the best of charisma or wisdom. So it was interesting. It allowed you to just kind of optimize in what you wanted to do and not be penalized mechanically for it. And again, like, that's fun. So fitting in the theme of what's fun is the right design decision. And the other thing that was introduced in here is, another thing you may recognize is that, okay, well, my wizard, if they've only got access to a handful of abilities, I'm never going to take anything that isn't combat related. And that's kind of true. Every class starting at 2nd level would gain access to something called a utility ability. And a utility ability was generally it wasn't an attack, and it didn't always apply to in combat. So it might be things like charm or command or things like that, like spells that more often than not had non-combat uses. I mean, that's not true. Command had tons of combat uses, but those types of things that you might use in non-combat situations, those are what utility spells were. They were, or utility powers. They were things that you could use to that weren't direct attacks on things. So that was one way that all the classes gained access to things that weren't just strictly combat. But there was also something called rituals. And rituals are basically anything that was probably going to be used in non-combat circumstances, like or that took a long time to cast in previous editions, like Raise Dead or Contact Planar Ally, or what were the other ones? Hero's Feast, things like that. Those are rituals, and rituals are kind of like they were very much like spells, but not quite spells. It's similar to the way that rituals work in 5th edition is not quite the same, but many of the spells that have the ritual version in 5th edition are treated as rituals in this. And the neat thing was that anyone could cast a ritual. If you had a scroll with it on it, anyone could try casting it if they were trained in the skill. And you could also learn the actual rituals yourselves and not have to use a scroll if you had the Ritual Master, I think, or Ritual Mastery feat. And a lot of classes, like the Clerics and the Wizards, got that right off the hop. So it gave a way of giving access to non-combat rituals. I don't know how things were at other people's tables, but for myself, I found rituals, I had to come up with ways to incentivize players using them because they more often than not just ignored them or didn't use them. And the reason was because you have to basically spend money every time you're using one. And it could have just been that, I was not playing with a very wide variety of players at the time, so it could have just been the way that we were doing things at our table. But the rituals were an interesting way of incorporating those kind of non-combat and important, classic D&D elements into the game. So that's all the stuff that was in the player's handbook, all your rules for how to play, your magic items. There's a wide variety of armor that would scale with the levels as well too, even non-combat stuff. I'll quickly show you what the magic items look like because there's an interesting way that they tier. So you see here, each of those orange things is a different kind of magic item. They come in different levels that cost different amounts, and then each you'll see it has like a property underneath them. Some of them are powers, some of them are enchantments that benefit certain defenses. Generally speaking, your armor would affect your armor class. Your neck item or neck slot item would affect your other defenses, and I think that's it. Then your attacks would be modified by what you held in your hand, whether that was a wand, a rod, whatever. This version of the game also makes a big difference in the same way that like using an axe and using a sword and using a spear has different advantages in different versions of the game. The game decided to try and make differences between the different implements that spellcasters use. So an orb and a rod and a wand and a staff or a tome will have different kind of abilities. And then for the wizards, at least, you get to specifically pick one of the things you get to pick as your class ability is your specialization. So you may be specialized in, say, like Orb of Destruction, which will allow you, or no, that's not right. That's a feat, not the thing. But there was a way of specializing. I can't remember offhand how it specifically manifested, but it made it so that you could make your rod wizard, and I don't know if they use rods. Maybe that was warlocks, but staff, dagger, tome, orb. Each of those things would be give you a different kind of ability. And that was further expanded as the game went on. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But each of those implements, you would anyone who wasn't using a weapon would need an implement to be able to make use of it. And the implements didn't give you any modifiers to your attack rolls with your abilities. But weapons would give, one of the ways that they differentiated the different kinds of weapons is that when you were proficient in a weapon, you would gain the proficiency bonus from that. And that's between +2, I think nothing is +1, but it's between +2 or +3. So, for instance, a longsword, the classic longsword, gives, if you're proficient in it, you get +3 to hit when you attack with a longsword, and it does 1d8 damage. It is also versatile, so you can hold it in two hands and do a little bit more damage, as opposed to the battle axe, which is only +2 with the proficiency, but it does 1d10 when you're using it, when you hit with it. So it gave a nice little way of kind of tweaking the different weapons that you could select from. Some had reach, and it's very much that was introduced in, or those kind of differences were definitely introduced in third. It's a different way that they manage them with a proficiency bonus in fourth. And then also because many of your powers would, at least for the martial characters, many of your powers would be based on your weapon damage. That would mean that there's incentives for using specific types of weapons as opposed to others. So, and this is what the weapon list would look like in that. Give you your full list, different powers. And then, of course, over the lifespan of the game, they introduced more weapons and such as well. So, the game gives you a wide variety of magic items, and I mentioned that there are rituals. Rituals are powered by something called residuum, and residuum was this like magic dust, basically. If you disenchanted magic items, you would get residuum equal to the GP value of it. Not like it would be the value of the residuum would be equal to the value of the magic item, and you could use that to craft other magic items, to cast rituals and whatnot. Again, like some folks found that to be a little too World of Warcrafty of just like, I'm going to disenchant this and then, use it to do something different. But again, like the game is primarily interested in fun, and that is a lot of fun. Like being able to get the weapon that you want, that you see working best with your build, especially with how important and how much the weapons can affect your overall strategy, right? Like if you got a rogue who, needs to have combat advantage in them. Combat advantage is a concept from this game that basically it's when you're flanking, when they're unaware of you, when they are prone. There's different things that give combat advantage. Combat advantage just gives a +2 to hit, and it also triggers certain things sometimes, like rogue's sneak attack. You need to have combat advantage to do that. If you're picking a thing, like say a magic item, that gives you combat advantage for the first round of combat, regardless of whether you go first or not, that's a huge damage spike right at the beginning of a fight. So a fighter, a rogue would want to gain access to that. And I think the other thing they realized is that not everyone runs the game. Again, for old school players, we stick by random dice rolls for random items and things like that. But there is a type of there are DMs who like tailoring magic items for their players, and there's a reason for that. Is because it's fun. If you get your your rogue gets a elven cloak or cloak of elvenkind, or if your paladin gets a holy avenger sword, that's really cool. That's a lot of fun, and the game it puts that fun decision-making process in the hands of the player. And so how the player is going to play at the table in terms of their powers and their rituals and their magic items is very much in the hands of the player, which is why that's in the player's handbook as opposed to the DMG. So that might seem like you're making for a much more powerful character, or powerful character certainly to start than what you were at later levels. And you're not wrong. Starting off characters in D&D 4th are much more able to experience the full aspect or the full impact and experience of what gameplay is going to be like throughout the life cycle of their characters. That's not to say they're going to have access to earth-changing, or earth-shattering, world-changing spells the way they will at higher level, or rather rituals. What it means is that the type of combat, the type of skill challenges and stuff that they're going to engage in, they're able to do all of that stuff right off the hop. They have enough hit points so they can experience the going down and being healed by a leader, or by using their second wind, an ability that every character has during an encounter to regain or spend a healing surge and regain their surge value. It doesn't, it means that you are able to have a wide variety of different abilities. So your character feels a lot more like you're part of a fully fleshed game, and the full game. You're not waiting until you can last more than 1 or 2 hits the way you are in most other versions of D&D. All other versions, I don't know. Like first level, depending on whether you're rolling random hit points or not, it can be really punishing, right? Like combat in particular is very deadly in old school versions of D&D and 5th edition at low levels. But I mean, and I don't mean that as a criticism. It's just like that's how things are. 4th edition allows you to get in and start playing like a badass hero right away, and that is what it is. That's going to be not this play experience that some people want, but that is what it is. So that's the player's handbook. A lot of information that's in there too, a lot of different selections, but there are some noticeable absences from the list of classes, the list of races, and so that's the player's handbook. Next is the DMG. And the Dungeon Master's Guide, there are 2 Dungeon Master's Guide for 4th edition, and they are they're phenomenal. Like setting aside the advice for the specifics of 4th edition, the advice they give on game planning campaigns, planning encounters, planning adventures, using NPCs, things like that. Like it is chock full of terrific advice. The things that are in here, they also give you great ideas for designing combat encounters, because combat encounters are so different in 4th edition than they are in any other version of D&D, really. It's particularly important for dungeon masters to get good advice on how to actually run the game. And I think that they do a pretty good job in this to get you up and running as to how to actually, start running your first game, how to structure your first encounter, and so forth. Before we talk about this, I do want to quickly talk about the monster manual. Actually, I want to grab a sip of coffee first, and then we'll talk about the monster manual. So, the first monster manual also introduced some very interesting changes to what D&D was up until that point. In the same way that how classes are organized, what classes give you the ability to do, and so forth, they also changed monsters substantially. One of the things they wanted to address was how complex it is to be able to run some types of monsters. In 3rd edition, in 3.5, they also wanted to address the way that there was extraneous stuff on monster sheets sometimes. If a monster was only going to be around for 4 rounds of combat, why did you need to know what 12 rounds worth of abilities are? And I mean, the answer to that obviously is like, well, if it may last longer and they want to have some versatility and blah, blah, blah. But that was the thinking, or at least that's what they said the thinking was. So with that in mind, the entries for monsters are dramatically simplified in 4th edition. And those who are familiar with 5th edition will recognize some of these kind of same things. Look at that. There's our Githyanki warrior. Let me get my stupid face out of the way so this will focus properly. So those are the sheets for a 13th, 15th level adversary. That's everything you need. You're not going to reference anything else. It's got all the rules for what the abilities do right on the character sheet and what the different options are. There are also icons to tell you what's a basic attack, what's not, what's an encounter. They introduce also a neat idea called recharge. So if a monster uses an ability, you'll then have a number on a d6 that you need to roll that you roll at the start of their turn. If you roll that number, then they can use that ability again. If you don't roll that number or higher, you can't use it anymore. It's got to wait until a subsequent round. So like Dragon Breath, for instance, is something that's on a recharge. A lot of like powerful, scary abilities that they don't want them using all the time, but are a really signature part of it, like Petrify, with a Basilisk or with a Medusa. Often those have recharge elements to them as well, too. And it didn't tell you had to tell the players that was going on, but I certainly did that. And it added an element of tension at the start of the round to see whether or not can that dragon, breathe fire again, or can that, whatever the thing that's recharging, can they use that cool ability again? The other thing they did is they categorized monsters into 3 different types, or 3 different, I guess, categories of monsters. Once again, I'm saying categories of categories. 3 different types of, broad speaking, classes of monster. And those are, is it 3? No, 4. 4 types of monsters. There's your regular monsters, which are just like what you'd expect. They've got one other thing. There's one other thing that they introduced in the player's handbook, and that's the bloodied state. Bloodied is when you're at half hit points. And there are a lot of things that might trigger, like a barbarian rage or something like that trigger at bloodied. So if I reference bloodied at any point going forward, that's what I'm talking about, is at half hit points. So a standard monster is just plain Jane monster. It has some neat powers. You're going to know what it can move, how it can move on the table and whatever. If it's got recharge abilities, those will be there. There is also an elite version, and elite monsters are things that have a little more. I just realized there's something else I forgot too. Another thing in the player's handbook, there's a lot of material in that book, is the action point system. An action point is every character starts a session with 1, and then you gain another 1 once you hit what's called a milestone. And a milestone is usually 2 combat encounters or like an extended sequence. And an action point can be spent to gain another standard action. And the action economy in 4th edition is that you've got 4 types of actions. You got reaction, and then on your turn, and reaction can happen on other characters' turns. The 3 ones you have are move, minor, and standard. Standard can be traded for one of those other 2, for a move or a minor. Move can be traded for a minor, and minor has to be a minor. Bonus actions in 5th edition, if you recognize those, that's kind of what minor actions were. But yeah, those are the things you had. So, standard monsters, there's the 4 kinds of monsters. Your standard monster. Tougher than that is the elite, and the reason elite made me think of action points is because elites have an action point. So they can spend an action point, take an extra action. They are usually tougher, so they got slightly higher defenses, they've got more hit points, and sometimes they've got nifty abilities that standard monsters will not have. Often they will augment other monsters, but if they're elites, because the elites are designed to be used alongside regular monsters, or the least version of monsters, the minion. A minion can be encountered from levels 1 to level 30, but the thing and their defenses will rise up, the amount of damage they do will rise up, but there's a couple ways they differ from any other kind of monster. For one, they only have 1 hit point. If you hit a minion, it dies, so it's like a stormtrooper. Secondly, they have standardized damage, so you don't need to roll for damage with minions. They do a flat amount of damage that is commensurate with their level. And they also sometimes have neat abilities. Now, and then the final version of monsters is your solo. A solo monster was intended to be like a boss monster in a MMO. It's a single creature that is a match for an entire party. And when this came out, you had all those different versions of monsters, but what they learned, I mentioned that there were different course corrections over the course of the history of the game, and what they found, there were a couple things that just weren't quite working the way that they intended. Fights were taking a little too long. Solos weren't feeling as good as what they should. If you recognize, or if you are familiar with legendary actions in 5th edition, that's what it's an implementation of the very similar rules for what a solo can do. However, by the time that the game was at the end of its life cycle, it had worked out all those quirks. So it had got the math right. It had got the way that solo monsters should go right. It got how minions and elites should feel right. Solos also had 2 action points as well. So those were the varieties of monsters. They need different categories of monsters. You also had different types of monsters, which were like a soldier who could had tactical ways. Often they could mark opponents. Marking is a way that penalizes targets from attacking anyone other than the one that marked them. If you are familiar with World of Warcraft, it's effectively the aggro mechanic in 4th edition. It's a way of making sure that either the enemies are attacking you, or they're taking a penalty or potentially getting tagged by you if they attack anyone else. It's you guarding someone. It's the fighter jumping in the way of the snarling ogre who's trying to get to the mage and saying, "Come on, get me!" It's giving it game mechanic for that. And in the same way that leaders each had different ways of healing, the defenders each had different ways of marking, which is pretty cool. Some of them slowed things down. Some of them, the fighter was the one who got to, bash you on the head if they attacked anyone other than you, or even shifted away. It was pretty awesome. But with the soldiers were the equivalent of that. There were brutes that had a butt ton of hit points, but with lower defenses, so it was easier to hit them, but hard to take down. There were artillery, which would shoot from range. There were they're not called controllers, leaders. I don't know. And basically what it is just it was shorthand for the DM to look at this and be like, oh, this is a skirmisher, so I should be using a couple of these with soldiers. Soldiers will pin the party down, and the skirmishers will go around the edges and pick at them. And what it did is it gave an easy way for you to figure out as the DM how to construct interesting and interesting tactical encounters. You could have the kind of fun, and it's not just for the DM, it was an enormous amount of fun to put it together. But for the players, having the challenge of reading an encounter, knowing that there was a tactical design behind it, maybe there's a line of minion archers in the background, but they got to fight their way through some tougher frontline guys. That makes for a fun fight while the frontline melee fighters are scrumming up with these tougher adversaries. Your wizards can feel like badasses in the background, zorching, boom, 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 these minions down or whatever, like you could do a spawning mechanic, have there's a massive undead dragon, but as it's fighting, you're seeing these, the corpses of dead adventurers are rising up and these minions are coming all over the place. So you could make really fun tactical encounters with it. And the advice for how to do that started with the DMG. So the DMG had lots of great advice for how to structure your adventures, the campaigns, because of the conscious decision they had to make a difference between the heroic tier, the paragon tier, the epic tier. They would talk about the progress of the campaign in those terms too, to give you an idea of how to how to play that out. There's also great rules for improvising stuff. So you've got things like a little table for if you just need to know what an appropriate amount of damage or whatever from different types of things. If your character's like, I don't know, like they got caught on an avalanche, or a rock slide, and you didn't think this was going to happen, you can look and say, all right, well, they're hitting a lot of people. We'll give them a DC that I can find from my table here to try and reduce it. They can make a skill check. If they fail that, well, then they're going to take whatever the damage that is appropriate for their level. They also gave you good advice in here for structuring your encounters. So, not just like PAP advice of like use artillery at a range. They would give you combos, like ideas of like, the 2-line fights, the bad boss or the, paired enemies. And it wasn't specific examples of, well, I mean, they did give that too, but it set it by like, by the level. So it would be like N-1 worth of minions and N+1 level, main boss. So it was very easy to look at the stuff and go, okay, I think in this sequence, I want to do this and make this kind of tactical encounter play out like this. You could look in the DMG. They give you great advice for doing that. And then they introduced as well the skill challenges. Now, skill challenges were something that I think were embraced very heavily by a lot of story-based or story games that came afterwards, because every story game that I've read, in particular like Powered by the Apocalypse games and Blades in the Dark or the Forge in the Dark games, a lot of those with the One Ring role-playing game, many of those just seem to be reworded skill challenges. You need to get X amount of successes using a variety of different abilities before Y amount of failures are incurred. And the skill challenges, like every other aspect or every other new aspect of 4th edition, it required tweaking over time. Not only the way that you approach it and how you could structure them, but also how to set difficulty numbers too. I snagged 2 of my DMGs, my DM screens from 4th edition, because to hold up here and to remind myself, because the DCs for different class or different skill levels are actually different between these two. And I think they're different between the DMG2 and the Rules Compendium, which is another book, or 2 other books we'll look at in a bit. But, and I mean, that's a bit of it's irritating that it changed over time. But I could see how it could be irritating, but for myself playing through it, it was interesting seeing them deciding to be like, okay, this isn't working, let's try this instead. And, that's the 3 main books that came out. And you no doubt picked up that there's probably a lot of stuff that I'm saying where like, oh, but this was tweaked after, or this was changed after. And the thing to remember, again, is that 4th edition, there's elements of D&D in there, but it's completely different game, completely new game. And I don't think it was particularly play tested either. So what it meant was, or at least not extensively widely play tested the way, say, like Pathfinder was or that 5th edition was. And so what you ended up with was there were some unintended, design decisions that just didn't quite work. But it was cool seeing over the course of the lifespan how that they changed those things. And this was the changes they were making were trying to tweak the existing formula. And that's all that stuff happened before we got to Essentials. Essentials was a reactive thing. The changes that were made before Essentials were efforts to try and refine this new game that they had written. And it wasn't until Essentials that something was clearly a response to how the player base was responding. The player base, I think, by the time that Essentials came out, were split between 4th edition and Pathfinder. But in any event, those are the first 3 books. Now, if you are looking to get into 4th edition, that is absolutely one way to get into that, is to just get those 3 books and then start playing. Lots and lots of adventures you can have, but and the DMG for 4th edition is phenomenal. The only reason I hesitate is because I had no difficulty with this. I had a lot of fun with this, but I think that some of the design changes they made later in the life cycle of the game was to the betterment of the game. So you might find some frustration if you're using just these 3 books to run your campaign. However, you could run a terrific game just with these 3. The other thing that's a bit of a frustration, this has had nothing to do with the design of it. I think that this is the only edition of D&D, apart from maybe 3rd, that you can get in PDF through the DM's Guild, but you can't get it in print for some reason. So that means that at least at the time of recording, if you're interested in diving into 4th edition, you have a choice of using PDFs or trying to track down something on the secondary market. And because of the sort of resurgence in interest in 4th edition, they're not cheap. I mean, they're not as expensive as, say, like AD&D players' handbooks or DMGs or whatnot, but they're getting up there. But in any event, that's the initial 3 books and what is extensively in there. I'm going to start going through some of the other products now, and I'm going to deal with them in a lot less detail. I'm not going to go through the full pages, and show you, or not the full detail of what it is. I think this gives us a good starting point of where the game was when it was first released, and then we'll see how the game changed. So that's our initial 3 books. Now what I'll do is I think I'll split those 3, and let's look at the player stuff, the DM stuff, the monster stuff, and then the setting stuff. That might be a good way to structure the next part of our conversation here. So as I said, the fan base was a little disappointed that some of the fan favorites that were reintroduced in 3rd edition were no longer in 4th edition. In particular, half-orcs coming back and barbarians. And bards were also not in there, but I mean, bards have been back in D&D, at least as a starting class in 2nd edition. Well, that's what the 2nd Player's Handbook was a response to. Player's Handbook 2 started a trend of introducing different power themes, so different kinds of powers. In Player's Handbook 2, a new power source called the Primal Power Source was introduced. And this set up so that druids and other similar, like nature-based, classes actually drew their power from a different source, as opposed to the way that they were in previous editions, where they were just iterations of divine gods. That's one other thing I should mention, maybe before we go on, is that the assumed cosmology in 4th edition is dramatically different from anything before or since. The cosmology is different in terms of how the planes are set out. They introduced the Feywild and the Shadowfell. So rather than the plane of shadow, there's a different kind of like parallel version, kind of like how the ethereal plane was always seen as coterminous with the prime material plane. The Shadowfell and the Feywild were sort of like other coterminous, as in like operating or occupying sort of the same space as our world, or the prime material plane at least. So the cosmology was a lot more wild and a lot more unknown with 4th edition. And anyway, the Player's Handbook 2 introduced a bunch of the return of some classic classes like Bard and Barbarian and Druid, and it also introduced some new classes like the Shaman and the Warden. So the Warden was those who are familiar with I think it's the Green Oath or Oath of the Green. I can't remember whatever the nature loving paladin oath is in 5th edition. It's very similar to what the Warden was. A Warden was a leather armor wearing badass who protected the wilds and used kind of like pseudo druidic magic to be a real tough protector. And it was awesome. We had a Minotaur Warden in our long running game, and they were a neat way of having a defender that used like druidic magic to fight its adversaries. So the Druid, by contrast, was more of a shapeshifter, so much closer to what Druids are. Well, I mean, Druids were shapeshifters in 4th edition, or in, 2nd edition D&D as well too, and 3rd edition, but it's much more front-loaded with Druids in 4th edition. The Spirit, or Shaman, was a primal leader, so they used, to be honest, the Shaman was a bit of a wonky class. I'm clearly people enjoyed playing it because we saw support for it over the course of the lifespan of the game. They used a spirit animal to kind of implement their powers and stuff, and it just always, I never could really wrap my head around how that looked in the fiction. So for me, the Shaman was a swing and a miss, but it was that's just my personal preferences. Oh, the other thing introduced was Invoker. I missed one of the best. So the Invoker, which is kind of like if you're familiar with oracles from Pathfinder 1 or Pathfinder 2 now, or I'm trying to think, the whatever the sorcerer with the what do you call it? Divine Soul, I think it's called, from 5th edition. It's basically a spontaneous casting divine being. They were a controller class, so like the wizards, but they used divine power. They were infused with the power of some gods, but in a much more like primal way than what clerics would be. There's also the sorcerer was reintroduced in this one too, and the sorcerers were pretty cool. They were strikers, so they were more damage focused than the controller type for where the wizards were. And then there was the Avenger. Now, the Avenger has not been reintroduced in 5th edition yet, but the Avenger is kind of like a holy ninja, and they had a really cool ability. If you think of it's very similar to Paladins, but more sneaky and more like assassin-y kind of stuff. The Avengers had this neat ability where they could mark a target. They could swear an oath of enmity against a certain target, and then whenever they were making attack rolls against that target, they'd get advantage. They would roll 2 dice and take the higher of the 2. It wasn't called advantage at that point, but that's where the advantage mechanic was first introduced, was the Avenger. And people loved the Avenger. It was a super, super cool thing. Will Wheaton famously played an Avenger on the podcasts, actually, when he joined in the 2nd season of the 4th edition podcasts. And what else here was new rituals were introduced, a lot of primal things. So a lot of those earth, and nature kind of oriented spells, non-combat spells were introduced in the 2nd edition. And then there were a bunch of new races that were introduced as well, too. The half-orcs returned, the gnomes returned, and then they introduced some new ones, too. The shifters were not new, but the shifters, which were from Eberron, the Eberron rulebook for 3.5, they're kind of like descended from lycanthropes. Well, shifters were introduced in 4th edition in this book. And the, the Goliaths were introduced as well as a class. Goliaths had previously been introduced in a book called Races of Stone, but now they became a core part of the game. And there was a race called the Deva, and the Deva were kind of like a race of reincarnated holy souls. There's a couple of experimental classes or races that were introduced in 4th edition that really did not ever, they weren't revisited, and no one was clamoring for them to be revisited. Every concept has some fans, so, there may be some ardent Deva fans out there, but the Deva were introduced in this. It's an interesting idea. I never use them in my games, and I don't. It doesn't seem like they were a particularly popular race, but that doesn't mean that they're not, someone didn't love them. And it was a neat idea. Like, one of the fun things with 4th edition is because they were throwing out so many, sacred cows with the design of the game, they could experiment with wild stuff. And we'll see that in the next book, some really wild stuff that gets introduced. So that's the Player's Handbook 2. It is not a standalone thing. It's an augmenting of the core rules, but it was a great book. We made a great deal of use out of this stuff, particularly for, the Wardens, the Bards, the Avengers, and Barbarians. Really, really cool book, too. And it was a neat way of starting the trend of introducing new powers or new power sources with each PHB. The third PHB and the final one that was released was Player's Handbook 3. Player's Handbook 3 introduced the psionic power source. And in addition to introducing a new power source, they decided to also introduce a greater level of complexity to the characters. The character classes from PHB 2 are pretty much, they're no more complex or less complex than what is in the original Player's Handbook for 4th edition. PHB 3 introduced some really fun concepts, like the different, just like the other classes or the other power sources, they would have different roles for each of them. So you had a psionic defender, who was the battle mind. You had a psionic leader, who was the ardent. You had a psionic striker. Wait, did you? I'm trying to remember here. You had a psionic controller, which was the scion. And did you have a striker? Let's see. Oh yes, the monk, of course. So you had the monk, and the monk was a psionic power source as opposed to divine or whatever. Each of those classes had different unique mechanics, sub-mechanics that you would have to sort of track. Like the Scion, interestingly, did not gain encounter or daily powers. Instead, the Scion had a well of psychic points or psionic power, and you could spend those power points to augment your at-wills. You got a greater variety of at-wills, but depending on, and you didn't need to spend power points, but if you did, you would also be able to augment and do other things with your at-will. So it was a neat kind of, it was a neat way of having a lot of versatility with a different flavor. And there's a little bit more resource tracking with that one than any other edition or any other character. No one else was tracking PowerPoints or things like that. But it was cool, and it definitely made the Scions feel very different from any of the other caster types. Monks were pretty cool because you could, a lot of their abilities had both movement and attack components. So they were very maneuverable and could be just an enormous amount of fun and have a lot of flexibility at the table. And then the battle minds, I don't remember what the special thing about them was, but the Ardent was pretty cool because the way that they thematically presented the Ardent was that they controlled the flow of emotions, either imposing negative emotions or negative mental states on enemies or heartening allies in kind of a similar way to like what bards do, but a little different because it's directly psionic. Each of those classes definitely had its own feel, except for maybe the battle mind. The battle mind always felt kind of, I'm not sure it necessarily occupied its own space the way that, like, say, a warden feels very different than a paladin than a fighter. Each of those feels very different in the way they play at the table. But they're also introduced two other classes. One was a seeker, which was basically think of like a magical ranger. It's a ranger type thing, lots of ranged weapons and stuff like that, but it uses the primal power source. So if you wanted to enchant your arrow and hit someone and then have it, flies come out after it's hit and harry it, or hit it and have it burst into fire, that's what the seeker was there for. So that while the ranger in the Player's Handbook was a martial power source, the seeker occupies, if you wanted more of a druidic powered kind of ranger type, that's what your seeker is for. They also introduced my favorite. I played this the most, a class called the Rune Priest. And the Rune Priest was it was a leader class. It had the divine power source, but it distinguished itself from the cleric because it had an ability to enter into different rune states. So you would pick either Wrathful state, or I can't remember what the other one was called. Wrathful or Protective? I don't remember. Defiant. And depending on what rune state you were in, each of your powers would have slightly different abilities, including your default healing ability. It would do different things. So I had a huge amount of fun with playing my rune priest. I played a Goliath rune priest, but I reskinned him to be Draenei from World of Warcraft, because I just love the image of that. And he'd wander around this giant hammer, and then I would use different colored dice to reflect the different rune state that he was in. That's just anecdotal thing, but it's the thing that was one of those little ways that I had so much fun playing those classes. Again, like more complex than what the other classes were, but they were really interesting. Another interesting thing they introduced in this book is another way of doing multi-classing. This book gives you rules for creating what are called hybrid characters. And basically what hybrids are is a little bit from two different classes. They did not all, like not every class combo was a viable one. You could do it, but you might end up with a pretty crappy character, like stats-wise. But it allowed you, it was very, very easy to make a very unique kind of character. So like, we had in our ongoing campaign, we had a Warlock Paladin hybrid. And the backstory for the character was that he was, he had been possessed by the fragment of a demon's soul after, trying to defeat this thing. I mean, it's a pretty tired trope, I guess, but it was a very fun character to play. Guy who could alternate between doing Holy Paladin stuff and whipping out Eldritch Blast, and then also the implied role-playing stuff. And then recently as well, too, in our recent replay too, I made two different characters that were hybrids. And I wish I thought of this before, but rather than calling them a hybrid, X and Y, I just gave the class a unique name. And it felt pretty freaking cool, like the guy who was playing the robber mage as opposed to the hybrid rogue wizard. Robber mage sounds a lot cooler, and it gives you a much better feel for what that character can do. And it was cool. I mean, it's a really, again, like a little more complex. This is also one of the ones where, or it contains something where it tried to basically correct an error that was made. Now, actually, now that I say it, I can't remember if it's this that introduced this idea or if it was PHB 2. But one of those two introduced something called implement focus. Now, you could get weapon focus has been part of the game since 3rd edition, and it was a thing in the new edition as well too. What implement was it? Implement focus? No, implement expertise. I don't remember. It's called one of those two things. And basically, the problem what they found is that while it was cool having proficiency bonuses for the weapons that you had, none of the implements had that. And what it meant was that weapon attacks more often than not had like +2 or +3 higher a bonus than what any comparable ability would have. And in 4th edition, everything is relative to your level. The math that drives the whole game is very much what you see in Starfinder and Pathfinder 2nd edition and whatnot going forward, is because it if your first level, your total bonuses, it includes bonuses to hit, bonuses to your defenses, to your skills. It includes your level. So a increasingly greater part of the your bonuses are factored in with your level, which means those small little modifiers of 2 or 3, they make a pretty big difference when everything is relative to your level. That meant that casters who were using implements like rod, staff, wand, orb, tome, whatever, they were often they had a much lower to hit numbers. So in either 2nd or 3rd, they introduced a implement focus feat that basically lets you get a bonus to hit, in the same way that the fighters could get proficiency bonuses. Trouble is, it kind of became a necessary thing. It was like a feat tax. That is how they refer to it in Pathfinder and in 3.5, where everyone was taking it. Like it was a no-brainer. You had to take that feat. So that was kind of But one thing I did like with this, they introduced the idea of I can't remember if they're called advanced or advanced implements or something like that. But anyway, what they were, superior implements. What they were is basically implements that gave a kind of bonus. So they would give you like sometimes bonuses to hit if it was an accurate implement, or it would allow you to shift someone an extra square when you shift someone. So it was neat ways to, like an orb of, orb of gloom, let's say. And then what that would do is if you had used a power that allowed you to shift someone one square, you could shift them one more square. And when you're building your character, you just get your feet with that. So then you could really be sliding people all over the battlefield. So that was a neat way to, in this one, to not only kind of offset that problem with the lower target numbers. Originally, the thought was that those other, like the defenses that most implement attacks would be targeting were actually lower than the armor class, so they didn't need the extra bonus, but it didn't really feel that way at the table, so it's an oversight that they made. It was a neat way of addressing it. I don't know if it fixed it necessarily, but I mean, it definitely made implements a lot more. You couldn't get something similar from like your, absent magic items in, say, like a weapon or whatnot. So that was pretty cool. So it introduced a new power source, a bunch of new things, races as well too. It introduced the Minotaur, which is awesome. In a callback to Planescape, they introduced the Githzerai as well too. If you're 5th edition, it was one of the books that fleshed out the Githzerai, Githyanki conflict. So the Githzerai are introduced in here. And then they introduced two other creatures, two other species, which are really unusual. One is the Shard Mind. And the Shard Mind is a sentient collection of crystal. I never had anyone play a Shard Mind, but it was pretty wild, And the other one, speaking of wild, were the Wilden. And the Wilden or Wilden, they were basically like a plant-based species. They were, honestly, they actually remind me from Starfinder of the Rhyphorians, who have this kind of like, seasonal influence for how they present, what color they are, and things like that. The Wilden are kind of similar to that. I don't think the Shard Mind or the Wilden were introduced in anything before 4th edition, so it was something that was unique to this. And again, like I never had anyone play any Shard Minds or Wilden. I tried to introduce a Wilden NPC, but I don't think the players didn't really grok with the character all that much. Or at least didn't jive with the character. But I mean, it's, again, like it was kind of cool that they tried. It takes up 2 pages of the book, as well as a couple like racial feats that you could get. So it didn't take up a huge amount of space, but it was cool that they were trying to, push the boundaries. And as a longtime Dragonlance fan, I love that Minotaurs were introduced in here. I think I had a Minotaur in almost every one of my campaigns that I've run with 4th edition, once this came out, that is. One thing I didn't mention as well, too, is that with each of these books as well, they also introduced new epic paths and new paragon paths. So you would find new ways to sort of, go on. And if I wasn't clear with it before, your paragon path is usually, at least for these books, is linked to your class. So it'll give you a variety of different options, but it is linked to a class. There aren't like, agnostic paragon paths that you can just jump into. And maybe, it's worth just, let's see if I can find okay, so I was going to give you examples out of here because these classes are so unusual. Maybe they wouldn't mean anything. But the neat thing with the Paragon Pass and the Epic path were that they gave you really cool kind of story stuff as well, too. Like, they weren't, bland things like, heavy weapon fighter or, fire mage. They had very, like, I think one of the druid ones is like Pact of the Blood Moon. And you would get these abilities that made you a real badass shape-shifting, claw monster. And there was one for the Warden that would allow you to transform into basically a tree and fight as a tree, which is amazing. So those are really cool. Each of the 2 books as well to introduce some new feats and things like that. But in in this edition, or in 3, they also introduced the idea of skill powers. So instead of selecting power from one of your classes, if you were trained in a certain skill, you could select those powers as well. So if you wanted to play, say, like a fighter with, who's like a combat medic, you could do that. You could make your selections using this to select a couple things. If you were a more diplomatic barbarian, you might swap out to take some of this stuff. So it was, and then feats also, like unlike the new edition or newer editions and the older editions, feats were categorized by tier, and you could replace feats as you went up as well. So Paragon tier feats were more powerful than what the Heroic tier feats were. Epic tier feats were more powerful than the others. So that is that's the Player's Handbook 3. They didn't have any other Player's Handbooks come out because they shifted rather than doing the tweaking of the existing game line, they decided to do a response in the form of the Essentials product. But before we talk about that, let's talk about a couple other things. So because the Dragonborn and Tiefling were brand new introductions the Tieflings were around since Planescape, but because they were, trying to get a good push for them as player character races, they also, very early on in the life cycle of the game, they introduced these things. Player's Handbooks for Tieflings and for Dragonborn. That would give you a bit of information about the characters. Also, the default setting for D&D 4th was a place called the Nentir Vale. The default pantheon in the core rulebook, the setting that's in most of the default adventures, the non-branded, like Eberron, non-Forgotten Realms things were set in this Nentir Vale setting. And the idea behind it was that instead of having these extensively populated regions like Forgotten Realms that has tons of other heroes and stuff like that, or Eberron that has tons of other heroes, this setting would be points of light. And what it would be is that there would be these small bastions of civilization, and around that, darkness, adventure, and the unknown. And the Nentir Vale was developed in these books. They don't give you anything about like Greyhawk or Forgotten Realms or what's the I can't remember the name of the setting for Birthright is, but none of those other things. But it was cool if you were playing one of those character classes. It gave you some good ideas for how to latch onto some role playing things. There are also the power line of books, and these include things like Psionic Power, Primal Power, Martial Power 2 and Martial Power 1, Arcane Power, and Divine Power. And what each of these books did is expand out the list of new, if they were casters or ritualists, they would expand the psionic rituals, primal rituals, or divine rituals, arcane rituals. They'd give new options for the different character classes. So the character classes that come from that power source, they would give them new options. When you make your character with it too, I should have mentioned this as well. When you make your character in 4th edition, you're not just selecting a fighter. You're selecting a kind of like a rough build, which will be like some class abilities you're choosing as well as the slate of powers. And what this would give, each one of the books gave at least one new build, for the different classes, as well as a bunch of new powers, sometimes new rituals, and just like lots of cool new options. Like, for instance, the Divine Power one gave you a build for the Paladin that kind of made them more of a striker than a defender. And I love that one because in World of Warcraft I played a Ret Pally, and I loved playing a damage dealing, holy holy Avenger kind of character. So those were the player characters. There's a lot of... One thing I cannot share with you is the online content, because during the lifespan of 4th edition, they continually released new stuff through Dragon, which was accessible for free, I think, either for free or it was a subscription base, and I accessed it through my subscription. Accessed? Geez, that word sounded weird to me. What it did is it gave a lot of different options, and in particular there were some options that came with a new component to the character creation matrix. I'm not going to talk about them, what those had, because it's either I'm not sure you can gain access to those things legally right now. So it's basically, it would be tantalizing you with stuff that you don't have, and some of the later products actually incorporated that thing. So we'll talk about that when we get to there. But in a similar way to how backgrounds work with Pathfinder 2nd Edition, there was something similar that was introduced later on, a theme in D&D 4th that I kind of wish they had introduced early on, because it would have been a cool way to slightly tweak and add a little bit extra flavor to character classes. But in any event, there was an enormous amount of material that was released through Dragon, not only or Dragon and Dungeon. Dragon had lots of cool new monsters and class abilities and things like that, and then Dungeon had great adventures, including the one and only adventure path that was released for 4th edition, which was the not Tyranny of Dragons, Scale of Dragons or something. I don't remember. It was okay. It was a bit of a mishmash, but there was lots of individual adventures in it that didn't fit together terribly well, but it was really it was a cool story. In addition, for more player focused, there were a number of magic item books that were released. Those include the Adventurer's Vault, which has a whole slew. This one came out almost. If it wasn't the 4th, it was the 5th product released for 4th. Came out very early in the life cycle. Adventurer's Vault 2. This introduced the idea of item kits or item sets as well, too, stealing a cue from World of Warcraft. It was a really cool idea. I wasn't crazy about any of the ones or many of the ones that were included in there. So Adventurer's Vault 1 is, I think, if you are looking to get into the game, is one of the most valuable purchases you can make for it. And there's also the Mordenkainen's Magnificent Emporium. Now, this came out, it has the same branding on it as the other versions of 4th edition, but it actually came out during the life cycle of Essentials. However, it's also really, really good. It's not quite as comprehensive, nor is it as long as the Adventurer's Vault. Like, you compare the two. Adventurer's Vault is slightly longer than Mordenkainen's, but Mordenkainen's has a ton of really great stuff in it as well, too. Both of those are great products. Both of them can stand alone, too. They don't rely on each other. But as I said, the Essentials line was a response to where the player base was going and how they were feeling about 4th edition, at least some of the player base. However, the Essentials stuff is also, I think, really good. It's a different feel to the game, and some of the classes definitely feel more like other versions of D&D, where you just have a class thing you're going up and you're getting some abilities as opposed to selecting at wills and things like that. And that's what we'll talk about now, is the 2 character books released for Essentials were these 2 things: Heroes of the Forgotten Kingdoms and Heroes of the Fallen Lands. They were everything you needed to create characters and to not necessarily to learn how to play, though. It did not have the full rules in it for like combat and whatnot. It was only about creating characters, and the selection of magic items and other things are quite a bit smaller. They between the 2 of them, they introduced many of the races that were many of the signature races that were in Player's Handbook 1. So Tieflings and Dragonborn and Eladrin and Elves and Dwarves and Humans and Half-Elves, as well as Drow, and I think that's it. And Shifters. Shifters were also introduced in this. The classes that are covered in here are, the first one covers the classics: Fighter, Wizard, and what is it? Fighter, Wizard, Rogue, and Cleric. But each of them gets at least at least two different kinds of characters. The two different fighters, there's a knight and a slayer, play very differently at the table. One is a striker, one is a defender. And the other book gives you rangers and druids and warlocks, and what was the other one? I don't remember. Paladins, of course. The interesting thing about these is the versions of the classes that are introduced in here. As I said, they're very they're much closer to the structure of every other version of D&D, where there's you can follow along the 30 levels of the character and you get different things as you go along. But all of them take advantage of the basic attack, or most of them take advantage of the basic attack mechanic, where what you're doing is, rather than having a bunch of at-will abilities, you have a basic attack, but you also have at-will abilities that can modify that. And that may be something like a stance that a ranger or a fighter takes, or a type of approach that you're taking. They do a neat thing with the defenders. Instead of marking targets, the tank build for paladin, or defender build for paladin, and the defender build for fighters have an aura that they set up. So it's an interesting way to make it look more like what every other version of D&D looks like, but it still does a really good job of making interesting and compelling characters. And the amount of variety, instead of selecting from a wide list of powers, what you're more often doing is selecting from different ways to modify your basic attack. So tactically speaking, all of them are as deep as what the other classes are. They just don't get to pick a lot of the powers that the others do. So I mentioned that the original version, like the PHB, the DMG, and the Monsters Manual, that you can, if you can track down the originals, or you're satisfied with PDFs, that's definitely one entry point. These, for players, as well as some of the other, if you're going to run it, you obviously need more, but as players, these are decent entry points as well, too. The classes you can build and the characters you can build with these books are easily equal to any of the other classes, and I think you can still get the full feel of the tactical experience and the skill challenges and whatever that makes up, and the magic items that makes up the 4E play experience. So, however, it's pretty obvious that this is a response to the success of Pathfinder, and they wanted to make a way of reminding people, hey, this is still D&D, but they did a really, really good job of it. Like it's a solid version, or it's a solid addition to the the library of books that you get for that. The last books I want to talk about. Forgive me, some dead air as I'm trying to grab these things, are the some expansion material that came out during the Essentials line. And these were more focused, rather than on powers, they were focused on expanding different different non-traditional aspects, magical aspects of the setting. And those include things like Heroes of Shadow, Heroes of the Elemental Chaos, Heroes of the Feywild, and the final release for 4th edition, Into the Unknown, which was a dungeon survival handbook, which introduced goblins as a player character race, which I loved. So what these do is, for the most part, each of them will introduce a new race as well. And I don't know if Heroes of the Feywild did, but they would introduce, Heroes of the Feywild gives you a version of an Essentials version of the Berserker. There is a Blackguard in Heroes of Shadow, some interesting new races, like playing a Revenant or playing a Vampire. I don't think they're called vampires, but they're Veloka, but it's a vampire. It's a demi-vampire. Playing a Shade. Here's the Elemental Chaos, if you want to play a badass elemental sorcerer, or a druid that taps into that power source, you get that. And then Into the Unknown was more of a hybrid kind of book where it was partly for players, partly for DMs. Gave you a lot of themes. Now, what a theme was something that you picked at first level, and then in the same way that Paragon Paths and Epic Paths or Epic Destinies would add to your character to augment your class as you went up, the themes were something that would augment the heroic tier. You'd get stuff as you go up. So it introduced some neat themes that were dungeon themed in this. Gave you the Drow again. As a player character race, and it gave the goblins and kobolds. I forgot that there were kobolds and Svirf Neblin. So if you want to play, what do you call it? If you want to play Deep Gnome characters, you've got that into the unknown. So that was the player material. Now there are, as we go through the settings, we're going to see some other stuff that is geared towards players, and I think that a lot of the player-based stuff from those, it was assumed that you would use them in wider games, but that was the library of stuff that came out for players. And as you can see, there's a lot of, just like the 3rd edition, they introduced a lot of new options. Their release cycle for it was very similar to 3rd edition, where they were, there was an annual player's handbook, there's an annual monster manual. It's the same pace that Paizo continues to publish their stuff at, right? Where you're getting a bestiary every year with Pathfinder 2, and you're getting a Alien Archive every year with Starfinder. With the release of Psionic Power. Psionic Power is the final of the Powers line before they shifted focus after Essentials to go with these players option books. And I mean, the players option books are pretty cool. For the most part, you cannot use some of the rules in there without the Essentials books. So the downside is that for these ones is that they are very much reliant on the Essentials. That doesn't mean it's only, I mean, Heroes of the Elemental Chaos includes rules for playing a sorcerer. But the trouble is not all the rules for sorcerer are in here or are in the Essentials line. The sorcerer stuff is in Player's Handbook 2 and the Arcane Power. So those books are, if you're adding to your other, like to your collection or whatnot, then, and you've already got a starting point of either all the Essentials stuff or the Essentials plus other stuff, well then that's, it's a good addition to it. But the power books, Arcane Power, Psionic Power, and whatnot, those, if you're playing a class that's mentioned in there, you can use it freely. Because if you're playing a class from something that's mentioned in one of those books, you've already got the player's handbook that has that class in it, or one of the player guides from the from the settings. So that's the player stuff. Let's talk about now some DM material. So DMG2 came out, I think, about a year after the first one, and it is a really smart edition that is reflective of what they learned from that first year of the game. They clarified how skill challenges should be run and gave examples of how to do that. They gave lots of advice on reskinning monsters. Because monsters had such simple stats in 4th edition, it was extremely easy to just, if you needed, like let's say you wanted to have the guys fight, or the characters fight an ogre, but they were level 3, and you didn't have stats, the stats for ogres start at, say, level 8 or 9. Well, then you just find a brute that's level 4 or 5, and then just reskin it. Call it something different. It was very, very easy because there wasn't a lot of, nitty-gritty rules to worry about how that specific monster played, how those rules for that monster played at the table. It was easy to just be like, okay, I'm going to use, Bugbear. I'm going to call it an ogre, and tweak some things here and there, and then be done with it. Great advice for playing, reskinning stuff for flavor as well too. If you wanted to, the example they give is one of the designers, his son wanted to play a fire archon, which is like a fire elemental kind of thing, and he just built it like a rogue and called it a fire archon, and that kind of, do that. It sounds cool. Empowerment for the players is, again, very much in keeping with the putting the fun first of 4th edition. They revised the damages for things like traps and incidental things. They gave, like I said, a great deal, not only a great deal of more information about skill challenges, but some really solid examples of it that you could just steal from and adapt for yourself. And I didn't go talk about skill challenges that much when I was talking earlier, but we recently ran I'm going to explain what they are in a second, but if you want to see them in play, I'm including a link at the description of this video to the 4 sessions of 4th edition that we played recently, and we had 2 significant skill challenges during that. And that was, I mean, it's my version of it, I guess. So if there's a fault with the way I ran it, then that's not going to help you. But it gives you an example of seeing what it's like in play. But the way that the skill challenges are really intended to function is to provide a loose role-playing structure to, or rather a loose game structure to role-playing sequences. So to give some drama and roll some dice and let players do cool things that they're good at, in things like, reconnoitering a keep, or like traveling through dangerous lands, or like tracking down an assassin, or like we had one of my favorites that we had was an airship chase in our Eberron game. The guys were trying to flee these opponents who were in a rival airship, and it was a skill challenge, and again, like you roll a certain number of successes before you roll another amount of failures. But there's all sorts of ways you can tweak that, and they give you great advice in here for that, for adding in staged difficulties or stages of failures, or ways to use skills to buy back failures, to try and not count towards your total of successes, but to buy back those failures so you don't hit that critical point where you all fail, or use skills to augment. And the recommend, I mean, you don't just sit there and say like, roll a health, roll a heal, roll a history, roll a whatever. Like, you're having a conversation about what would apply and how the players are doing it in the same way that you would narratively describe combat. So it can be an awful lot of fun. I mean, some of them weren't terribly well communicated in the earlier editions, but the DMG2 is great. It also includes revised numbers for like target numbers and for different levels, because again, your target numbers will be relative to your level. But those were changed again in the Essentials line, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Actually, let's talk about that right now. The replacement for that was actually 2 books, or 2 box sets, technically. Well, 1 box set, 1 book. 1 box set was the Dungeon Master's Kit, which included this little sucker here, which had everything you needed to know to run the game. And that was a lot of the same ideas and same advice that was in your DMG and DMG2 was in there. But if you needed just the bare bones and just the rules, this little guy, the Rules Compendium, that's everything you need to run the game. It has all the rules of the game in there, everything. It does not have equipment, doesn't have character creation, doesn't have magic items, but the rules are all here. And this is the most up-to-date version of it. The target numbers in here are the last versions that came out. I am surprised this book is still holding together, because I used the hell out of this thing. I really, really like it. It's got great... it doesn't have the advice that you get in others in the DMG, but it has all the different implementations of skills. And I guess I should maybe mention the way skills differ as well. Skills, which you would be using in your skill challenges, are a lot closer to how they are in 5th edition, in the sense that it's very loose. It is much more interested in having a fun narrative, role-playing kind of experience, more so than rolling for a specific target number to get a defined effect, the way that you did in 3rd edition, 3.5, and Pathfinder. The DM was largely responsible for sort of interpreting that stuff and setting the difficulty classes for it, but it made for a lot more... the characters felt more powerful for sure, but it can make for really, really fun and immersive role-playing stuff. For instance, if you're trained in Arcana, you could use it to detect magic. Like, you could sense it with it, and then you could do all sorts of fun other stuff with it. Like, Arcana would be your skill you'd use to defuse a bomb, and you may have a skill challenge as part of a tactical encounter. I had one that was the guys were trying to disarm this doomsday device that was going to go off. And it was a collection of people using thievery and arcana and stuff like that to try and get this thing to diffuse while everyone else is fighting and holding off the big bad and his minions, right? So the rules compendium does not give you the advice stuff for that, but it gives you everything you need to know about running the game, including suggestions for using all the skills and whatnot. The DM's kit, like, I honestly am not familiar enough with it to say one way or the other whether this is a good just general purchase. But I mean, the rest of the Essentials line was really, really, really good. So if you cannot get a hold of the other two DMGs in print and you really want them in print, but you can get a hold of that, I think it's probably a good replacement. Much of the same advice. And then the replacement for the Monster Manual. Oh, hold on. We haven't got to that yet. Let's talk about the monsters. So, monsters, just like the other books, started going in a cycle of releases. The first thing that came out for it, though, after was one of what ended up being four thematic releases. And the first one was Open Grave. All sorts of undead, awesome stuff in there. It's a great book. I think that some of the math is not consistent with the later versions. So like solos have too much health, elites have too much health, and maybe defenses are too high. Solos don't have enough abilities to kind of keep them interesting, but there's more than enough amazing stuff in here. They also, I should say, with the DMGs and with this as well, they introduced an idea of templating. And templating is not the way it worked in 3rd edition or Pathfinder, where you slap something onto someone and they get like an elemental quality to them. It's sort of like that, but it is a much smaller change, and it is a much more flexible change. So it could be like that elemental thing. Someone could be associated with cold or whatever, but it also could be like, death cult. And there's different things, and what they suggest you use that for is to play up the thematic elements in the tactical encounters. So, if you're constantly fighting things that are, vulnerable to radiant because they're all suffused with radiant damage because they're all suffused with necrotic energy, or an elemental cult where they're all have a flaming quality, they're immune to fire or have resistance to fire, and also do 1 point of extra damage with fire. And you supply that to every one of the monsters you use. This has some great ideas for that as well. And then this was followed up with the Demonomicon, which had some good suggestions for possession and so forth. And there's two other ones. And these ones were a bit baffling because they don't have the same trade dress as the others. Like, these look like with the same colors as the Monster Manual, but the two Draconomicons that were released, the Chromatic Dragons and Metallic Dragons for 4th edition, they have the branding that's unique. It's the stuff that they use to signify like setting source books. So, but these are also, they're effectively dragon versions of what Open Grave is, and Demonology. They are not quite as pretty as the 3rd edition or 3.5 version of the, I think it's 3rd edition. The 3rd edition version of the Draconomicon is one of the most beautiful dragon books you can get. It's so beautiful. This is not as nice looking, but it's got great content and some good suggestions for not only how to thematically include your dragons in your setting and in your games, but also some good ideas for tactical encounters and whatnot. And those books came out in that middle range where they'd started adjusting and they had a better sense of what the game was and what you could do with it. There were also two other Monster Manuals released, Monster Manual 2 and Monster Manual 3. And you'll notice that each of the different Monster Manuals features a different Demon Lord on the cover. So we got Demogorgon here, the great, what do you call it, orangutan, baboon one there, baboon version. Loth on that one, and then Orcus, of course, was on the first cover. They also saw an iteration or an evolution of the math, and by the time Monster Manual 3 has some amazing monsters in it. Not just like neat creatures, but good rules, like neat ideas for making fun tactical encounters, and dynamic encounters too. One of the things that they really started experimenting with as the system went on is that they started introducing different abilities that monsters could use to make for more dynamic and moving fights. The thing that I credit most for my encounter designs chops from that I got from 4th edition is how easy and fun it is to design set piece encounters. And by set piece, I mean like a set piece is a action scene in a film or a TV that that makes use of that its character comes from where it's happening and the things that's around it. So it's a fight in a cafeteria, that makes use of food and trays and tables and chairs and stuff like that and whatever. 4th edition gives you an enormous amount of abilities or tools as a DM to design really fun, mechanically satisfying set pieces. And as players, you have lots of fun ways of responding to that too. Yes, you have your at-wills, you have your whatever else, but because the DM can so easily improvise damage and things like that, it's right on the back of the DM's screen, it's really easy to take advantage of those things. One of our most fun and memorable set pieces was fighting on a sloped, sinking ship that had waves washing over. And I'd never seen the players made terrific use of the scenery for that. And then what happened with the Essentials line is they continued the refinement of the monsters or monster rules that they did in 3rd, and released this thing called the Monster Vault. And then shortly after that, they released Monster Vault: Threats to the Nentir Vale. The Monster Vault book that's included within is this little sucker here, too. Another one of these little guys. The binding is not great on here. Mine has not failed yet, but I feel like that is a check in the mail. However, the monster stats in here are fantastic. So good. What I mean by good is that they do what they're intended to do. Like, a solo is a really fun and challenging fight. If you take any of those monsters out of there, reskin them, or just use them as is, you can make for really great stuff. And you can get solo satisfying like boss fights as early as 1st level with the stuff from that book, which is awesome. And we in our actual play that we played recently too, the 4-parter, that sucker ended with a boss fight. Spoiler, but it ended with a boss fight in it. So we got a chance to show how minions can be cool, how regular monsters can be cool, how skill challenges can function. But the tactical component of it, like it makes for characters who have so many things they can do and how durable they can feel sometimes. Solos can make for a really, really great challenge for those heroes, and it makes it all the more satisfying when they're successful in taking down those adversaries. So that's the monster books. Some other stuff that they released for it too was a series of planar books. Like I said, they dramatically changed the cosmology for it. So Manual of the Planes came out, followed by 2 books that dealt with the plane above and the plane below. None of those 3 are necessary whatsoever. I think those are cake, or they are icing on your cake. They're not even that. They're ice cream on the side of your cake. Totally unnecessary books. They've got some interesting stuff in it. And then Underdark was another one. There was a box set that was released as well for the Shadowfell, which I forgot to take out, but that what do you call it? That Shadowfell book or box set has some really good stuff to expand that. They never released a Feywild one. I imagine they were hoping to at some point. But let's talk about the settings though. Before we get to one last thing that I'm going to tie into my recommendations for if you are interested in checking out 4th. We saw about every year of the life cycle of the game, we saw a new campaign come out. The first one was Forgotten Realms. Now, Forgotten Realms, for those who are long-term fans of the Forgotten Realms, may remember way back in the hoary days of 2nd edition, when the 2nd edition rules came out, they basically had an in-universe event that explained why suddenly magic was working differently. It was the Avatar cycle, and or the Avatar series of novels. There was a fight between the gods, basically, and I don't know why they felt it was necessary. I mean, you could have just said, look, this is the way magic has always worked, but there you have it. But that set a precedent for changing the world to fit with the current rules. And Forgotten Realms did that in a huge way with 4th edition. I'm not going to get too much into it, because if you are interested in it, you're free to follow up with the books. But basically, they mashed up the world that the Forgotten Realms, the planet that the Forgotten Realms is set on, has always been called Aber Toril, and I think it's mostly just been called Toril. But it's basically said that Aber is actually a separate planet, and then that they sort of mashed together so that some stuff from Aber came in, and there was also stuff that was Toril, that was the old Forgotten Realms setting, and this was their explanation for why there was suddenly a shit ton of Dragonborn and stuff like that, and why there were suddenly tieflings. So I never played during that time, and I'm not a big Forgotten Realms fan, so I can imagine if you were really invested in that setting, that would be a bit of a piss off to suddenly have that different. But there was also an event called the Spell Plague that changed how magic worked in it, and that was the explanation for why suddenly wizards were different and sorcerers were different. I don't know if that was necessary. I'm sure that people would have been pissed off one way or the other. So, it's a decision. And I suppose in keeping with some of the other really bold decisions they made with the system, it's cool that they went big, rather than going safe. But the Player's Handbook in this is of particular interest because it introduces the Arcane Defender, which is the Sword Mage. And regular, or at least fans of long-term D&D may remember a type of elven fighter mage called a Blade Dancer. And a Blade Dancer is something that was introduced in I don't know if it was introduced in the Complete Book of Elves in 2nd edition, but it's around that time. And basically what they are is fighter wizards. They wear light armor and whatever else. The Sword Mage works a little differently to that. It sort of occupies that space and is very elf or Eladrin oriented, but it's got a lot more teleporty stuff in keeping with the Eladrin, phase step ability. It's a very interesting class, and then it was supported more in the Arcane Power as well. And then they introduced a bunch of stuff like regional feats or regional background benefits. So there was neat ways to customize the class or to customize your character for the particular setting. And they also introduced 2 new races. The Drow were introduced in here because everyone loves playing Drow apparently. And they introduced the Genasi, the elemental infused characters. I think they released the Genasi again in that Heroes of the Elemental Chaos. But it was a really great. The Genasi were all really, really interesting. Had interesting powers, and it was different if you came from fire or earth or whatever. And then in one of the Dragon magazines that were released online, they added other elementals like Void Elementals or Shadow Genasi and Void Genasi, Dust Genasi, and so it was just again in keeping with fun being first. Those are kind of fun ideas to think of for your, building your character. The second setting that they went to, I guess they learned from the response from Forgotten Realms, and they released Eberron as a second, and again in 2 different books, one for the players, one for the campaign guide. And this one, no catastrophic events. They just did, like I said, of it's always been this way. I don't know what you're talking about. Wizards have never prepared this many spells. They just ignored the rules difference and just gave you a way of playing Eberron in, with 4th edition rules. They also introduced the Warforged right there, the big magical robots as a player character race. They introduced the Changeling, which are descended from doppelgangers. And they introduced the Kalashtar, which is a class, a very, very unique kind of not hybrid, but kind of like the Trill in Star Trek. But instead of having a parasite, you have a fragment of a immortal psychic being from another plane infused with your soul. So they're a very, very cool part of the Eberron setting. But those are the new races that were introduced, and they introduced a new arcane leader, which was the Artificer. So the Artificer it feels, compared to the 5th edition version that came with the 5th edition Eberron and the 5th edition, what is it, Tasha's Book of whatever the fuck, that has, that class is very different from the Artificer out of here, but it's an interesting addition. Unfortunately, because the Artificer came out either contemporaneous with or after Arcane Power, we never saw any further material for the Artificer, unless it was in a Dragon magazine that I missed. So that was that. Unlike the Forgotten Realms one, the campaign guide also does a much better job of giving you the not mechanical, but like the necessary information you need to get your players invested in Eberron and get them playing right away. By that I mean, like, they'll give you a list of, if you have an Arcana of X amount, if you make an X amount check, then this is what you know about, this nation or whatever. So it's very, very easy. Like, let me give you an example here. You can see in the land of Onder with mages and farmers, if you make an Arcana, your player says, what do I know about Onder? Well, give me a Arcana check, and we check to see how well they did, and we tell them what they need to know from here. You can obviously feel free to ignore that, but I like having that as an option to give you an idea of what's secret, what's not. And if you're not, I'm not going to go into it too much, but if you're not familiar with Eberron, the thing that definitely makes this setting stand out from all others is that Eberron is way more high-tech, way more magical, and it is a much more cosmopolitan setting, much more urban. It's very much more of a pulp adventure along the lines of, like, Indiana Jones or something like that, or the Maltese Falcon or Casablanca. Intrigue, secret temples and stuff like that, secret societies, nasty evil cults and whatever. It's a phenomenal setting, and the 4th edition version is quite good. The final classic setting that we got was a bit of an unusual one, and only in the sense that I don't think people were clamoring for this setting, but there's other settings that people thought they would go to first. But that would be the world of Dark Sun, the Burning Sands of Athos. And this is with the release of the Player's Handbook 3 that had the psionic rules in it. They released this, and instead of having one player's book, one DM's book, they did a creature catalog that had a bunch of great monsters in it. The math in this is terrific as well, too. Great monsters. And then they gave you the Dark Sun campaign setting. And apart from giving you some, again, themes, so something that works in parallel with your class during the heroic tier, the first 10 levels, it also gave you some, and every one of the themes is very thematic. It's things like, noble or gladiator, things that are very appropriate for the setting. You get rules for many of the Dark Sun classic races, like the mules, the half-dwarves, the Thri-kreen, the insect warriors. Whoop, there we go. Kreen. Really great stuff. Like, for myself, I'm a big fan of Dark Sun. I don't know if you can see my box set right behind there. Huge Dark Sun fan anyway. And the 4th edition version of it was very, very good. One of the interesting things they did as well is they gave rules in it. Because Dark Sun is again, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if you're not familiar with Dark Sun is a setting with very, very little metal. Psionics are very powerful and very omnipresent in it. It's a desert world for the most part. It's ruled by evil sorcerer kings who have these city-states that rival, that rival each other. The 6 sorcerer kings have been in charge for thousands and thousands of years, longer than anyone can ever remember, apart from this mythic age from some time before. And they're evil and cruel, and that's basically your government you're dealing with. And those who survive on the wastelands and whatnot, they've got to make do with whatever they can either fight to secure or fight to hold. So it is much more of a swords and sorcery, hard Scrabble kind of thing. You're not collecting a bunch of magic items and shit like that. So if you don't want to break the math in the game, because the game makes assumptions about characters having certain kinds of magic items or certain bonuses by a certain level, the game gives you, or this book gives you, rules for just adding those modifiers in. So if you want to play still use 4th edition rules, but play a more grounded game that doesn't have a lot of magic items, although, again, like the magic items are a big fun part of this, but if you're playing in a setting like Dark Sun where you don't want to do that, this gives you ways of doing that without breaking the math in it. So I think that's pretty cool. Critics of it might say, well, why do I need that if I, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, like, every game's got to be about something and not be about something else. And by making choices of what your game is about, it invariably means it's not about other things. D&D 4th is largely about getting cool shit and using it to slay monsters. This gives you a workaround for playing a more magic sparse or magic rare kind of setting. So the last thing that was released, Dark Sun came out before the Essentials line came out, the shifting of the Essentials thing. But the last setting book that came out for it was part of a multimedia kind of initiative by Wizards of the Coast and their licensors, and that is the Neverwinter campaign setting. And if you are looking to get into the 4th edition and you want to get a full experience of it but have everything you need to run with, the Monsters Vault, the Rules Compendium, or the DM's Guide, the Heroes of the Essentials books, and this thing would be everything you need to not only run an amazing campaign set in Neverwinter from level 1 to 10, but as far afterwards as you want to go. This campaign setting has enough material to get you up to level 10. It includes a ton of great themes that link right into what's going on in the city. Like, it is a terrific example of how you could structure a campaign using the Essentials rules. It gives you great extra information for things like gods that have a presence in here. So Corellon Lorathian is an elven god that's not in the Essentials books, but it's in here. Great rules for different themes that link heavily to the different factions that are in Neverwinter and vying for attention. Tons of adversaries and suggestions on where to, what things to use against the players at different levels. Great suggestions for skill challenges that relate to everything from like exploring a rift to like infiltrating a drow enclave to negotiating with, I can't remember Sphere Nebulin, but there's some other underground race you deal with. So, and it also introduces the Bladesinger. I mentioned the Bladesinger as being kind of what the Sword Mage was. Well, the Bladesinger in this is a wizard build that is very much on the Essentials line, but it basically allows you to cast kind of spells, but do a lot of your magic ends up being focused through your weapons, and it is much more of a controller or striker than the defender that the Sword Mage is. So it is a terrific example of what could have been done and could have been seen going forward with the Essentials line if they hadn't decided to kill the edition. The last thing I'll mention too, there are a bunch of adventures that were released for 4th edition, but there's very few of them that I found to be particularly interesting. They did do like riffs on classic adventures, so there's a good Tomb of Horrors one. There's a Expedition to Undermountain one. There is a series of adventures that riffs on the whole Giants one. Chris Perkins of DM to the Stars kind of fame, he wrote an update of all the classic Giant series for 4th edition, and it's really, really good. But one of the ones that if you're going into it with the more accessible and probably cheaper, to be honest, stuff, and you want to get a sense to see if 4th edition is something that you'd be interested in investing more stuff in, let me suggest Madness at Gardmore Abbey, particularly if you don't want to play in the Neverwinter setting. This is an adventure that takes you, what is it here? What levels do you have to be? An adventure for characters of 6th to 8th level. I forgot that you have to be at high level. But this is awesome. It is the closest to like a sandbox game or a sandbox adventure And if you're not familiar with that, for old school players, sandbox means players can kind of go and do what they want, and when they go to a place, they will encounter and deal with whatever is there. It's a type of campaign that allows characters to a lot more freedom and flexibility for dictating what the game is going to be about. It's a great adventure, and it includes a copy of the Deck of Many Things in it too, which plays a pretty big role in the adventure. I won't say any more to spoil it, but I forgot that it's higher level though, so I mean, I guess it's not a good choice for a starting thing. I'd stand by the Neverwinter one though, the Neverwinter campaign setting. If you just want to have a pick up and go, ready built campaign, or you have an example of how to use it, that would be a great thing to start with. So I think that's everything. That's everything that at least I didn't talk about some of the adventures. I didn't talk about some of the online content. Right near the end of the life cycle, I think as they were trying to get out all the best ideas that they had for it, they released a series of articles that released a whole bunch of themes that were in the like wizard, priest, warrior, rogue kind of thing that added a lot to the low level play for 4th edition. So if you can track those down, or if you're interested in 4th edition and you want to incorporate and have more options for your themes, or see more examples that you could make up for yourself, tracking those down is good. But I don't know how you do that right now. I saved my PDFs from before, so I still have those. But yeah, so that's 4th edition. That's the life cycle. That's the books that came out for it. Obviously, as you can tell, I'm a big fan of the edition. I had a lot of fun. But if you're a regular viewer of the channel, you'll also know I don't run a lot of it on the channel. And 4th edition, like any other game, as I said, it has some very bold design decisions. And combat in 4th edition is some of the most fun combat that I've had anywhere in any other game. And the skill challenges are a phenomenal way of adding a fun rules element to the conversation about what's happening that might otherwise be like reduced to a single dice roll in some other games, or might just be hand waved and just role played through, and wouldn't give the players an opportunity to take advantage of the stuff on their character sheet. So who is this for? Who would who might want to play 4th edition at this point? And I'm really glad that I played 4th edition again recently, because up until I got it back to the table, up until I made pre-gens for my players and got it back to the table, I honestly would have said, I'll just run Pathfinder 2. Pathfinder 2, I felt, did a lot of the same, had a lot of the same tactical depth that 4th edition does. It's a little lighter on its feet than what 4th edition is. And because of the math in that game, it also satisfies some of the things like bosses and minions and stuff like that. But it's not 4th. Because 4th has those express like roles and specific class abilities that augment and supplement you playing your character in that role as a defender, as a striker, as a leader. There is nothing like 4th edition combat. It is a very, very unique experience. The videos that I mentioned at the outset made it sound that the criticism was that either it was too many things you were keeping track of, so it was just, a lot of numbers or whatnot, or there was a feeling of sameness between all the classes. And the reason I say that I think that is a bad faith attack on, or criticism, I should say, not attack, and not, divorcing them or invading their country. The reason I feel it's a bad faith criticism is because, like, that's true of every role-playing game. If you choose to just focus on the rules components of any game, in particular, like story games, a lot of story games are just based down to rolling a d6 and figuring out what's happening. Old school D&D is extremely simplistic as well too. Even modern D&D is very, very facile, at least the actual task resolution for the components. So if you don't add the role-playing stuff, if you don't look at the nuance of the rules, and and you don't incorporate that stuff into the fiction, well, of course it's going to feel all the same. But it's not. Like the specific rules that apply for every single different leader. Yeah, every single leader has a specific healing ability that just lets you spend your thing. But that little difference that you get from that matters. whatever little small thing you get from it, that is a significant thing. And, or at least it can be if you choose to pay attention to it, or if you play it up in the game. In the same way that like getting advantages to hit or whatnot, or advantages to your stats, more so in old school games because they don't have as big of an effect on your characters. It's crazy to me. It's bonkers to think that like, well, all of this just feels the same. It's like, well, then you're running it wrong, And in terms of the amount of complexity, fourth edition can definitely, the tactical combats with a lot of stuff on the board can get very complex. But so can every game. So every game where you track modifiers that are situational and you have to keep your eyes on them. I run Shadowrun 3rd edition, and that is no more complicated than what this is. Judging from the time we spent in our tactical encounters, it has not taken us any longer than AD&D 2nd or any of our 5th edition fights. I just don't feel that is that's accurate, or at least it's being selective of how you assess 4th edition as opposed to other versions of the game. Now, that's not to say that because there's so many specific rules about squares and things like that, and because it is a very mobile, tactical kind of game, it can feel very board gamey if you choose that. One of the reasons we stopped playing 4th was not only because 5th was coming out, but also because we had a break and started playing Battletech, the tactical miniature game where you're playing giant robots fighting each other. We had a spat of 3 months where we played that and nothing but. Came back to 4th edition, and suddenly we felt like, oh shit, this feels an awful lot like Battletech. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to get the game back to the table before I did my overview. But after running for myself, like I said, 130 or whatever it is, 140 sessions of AD&D this year, seeing how 4th edition compared to that was no more finicky, and the players, I think, had an enormous amount of fun. Like each of the fights, because of the way that the D&D 4th mechanics work with rolls, with different kinds of monsters and things like that, it gave it gave them more tactical options, and clear tactical options than like trying to role play something in another version of D&D of where you're just trying to kind of come up with some neat improvised thing like cutting a chandelier or whatever. But that said, it is a very different animal, from other D&D. So the if you're gonna run, if you want to choose a game that's got, I'm not saying who it's not for. That's stupid. You'll be able to judge whether this game is not for you. If you want to have a really fun wahoo time in combat, in action sequences that are framed by way of skill challenges, if you want to have fun, selecting magic items and, powers and things like that, this is a terrific game. And I did, in the 3 years that I ran 4th edition, we did as much role-playing in that as we did in any other game I've run. The main difference being is that because the game has extensive rules for combat and very, very light on their feet skill rules, if you're more used to having a structure of like skill rolls or skill challenges, or not skill challenges, but like having skills to inform how you navigate your role-playing or other parts of the game, you may need to be doing some improvising or come up with clever ways of making skill challenges to do that. Negotiation is one of the examples out of the DMG2. I've had a board game, in Eberron, there, Carnathi have a game very much like chess called Conqueror, and I made a skill challenge that was that, so the players engaged in a fierce game of Conqueror with one of their adversaries, one of the rogues they face in that. And for DMs, if you want to have an opportunity to, and assuming that you're not going to run just one, like for myself, I run almost every version of D&D. I'm an equal opportunity offender. I love all versions of D&D, including both versions of Pathfinder. If you want to brush up and get some ideas, for how to run set piece encounters and to run more tactical encounters in your 5e, in your AD&D second games, in your Pathfinder 2 games. Some great suggestions. Not for nothing, a lot of the designers that worked on this have gone on to work on Pathfinder 2, and Robert Schwab, who is behind Shadow of the Demon Lord, another game I love. He was one of the key architects of the later life cycle of the game. So there's a ton of great stuff you can have from this. It's also fun, like I keep saying that it's just fun. Sometimes in some of the games I like running, like AD&D Second is for sure my favorite brand of D&D for most ongoing games. I also love using the other versions of D&D for different things, but AD&D Second is the thing I definitely prefer for my ongoing games. But fourth, the thing that came from that is just how the players seemed to so thoroughly enjoy every element of their character, their powers, their magic items, the way that they, when they discovered magic items and were like, oh, cool, I can do this now. That is something that, and then when you present them with fun tactical encounters where they get to make use of all that stuff in a creative way, it is not the same thing as, being able to just, in old school games, you have to be clever to improvise things because they don't have rules for things like tripping a giant, or digging a trap and leading orc horde into it, or like digging a pit. And there's not specific, you're not going to roll a dice and then do that. You'll have to figure that out yourself. In the same way, or conversely, in combat in 4E, I think the tendency sometimes is to keep just looking at your character sheet, and then just saying, oh, this is what I can do. I always advise players and reinforce them, like, look, you can try anything. It's so easy to improvise stuff in this game because it's just an athletics check or a basic attack, or I can improvise damage when you push a brazier burning, thing onto your adversaries. It's and it's so easy to improvise stuff because of if you need to just open the book and add new monsters in, it's easy. The minions make the players feel like total badasses when they're mowing them down. We had a great scene in our recent game where they're mowing down a bunch of zombies and running away from them while there's scary ghouls chasing after them as well too, across the rooftops of an undead-filled neighborhood. Like, great stuff. And yeah. So that said, your players, if you do decide to run this from a DM perspective, and one thing I would suggest is you make sure your players are aware that you need to keep things moving. People should be deciding what they're doing while it's other people's turn, because of how much teamwork plays a role in this, more so than other games. Yet players need to be paying attention. They need to be seeing what everyone else is doing and then jumping in, because it's incredibly rewarding when you see people do amazing teamwork stuff, in the game. That's true in any role-playing game, but in particular in this, because of the synergy between certain classes and roles and powers and whatnot. It's a really, really, it is enormously fun to watch the players, high-five each other, whether virtually or in person, because of an awesome combo they pulled off. So, yeah. But again, like I said from the outset, the game is not shy of its inspirations, I don't think, in the same way that, and this is just my personal perspective, in the same way that I am not beholden to any one edition and I'm not beholden to rules as written, I think that, the idea that this edition took great ideas from what makes some video games really fun and tried to implement them in a tabletop format is not in itself a bad thing. It may be bad for you. It may be the wrong thing for you and your table, but it is not in itself a bad thing. For myself, I particularly like it, and I know fans of the edition particularly like that too. So with that, I think that should cover everything for at least everything I can think of right now. I'll quickly pop in and chat, see if anyone has anything that I have missed that I should address as well too. Let's do that quickly and then see what's going on here. Holy smokes, chat's active today. My goodness, I may have to address that afterwards. Oh my goodness. Well, first, hi everyone in chat. Thank you so much for joining me today, guys. I'm sure that there's some really helpful suggestions and comments in chat as well too. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that, at the end of the day, if the game, this is not Dungeons and Dragons, in the same way that there's people who don't like Dungeons and Dragons, fourth edition may just not be for you, and that's completely fine. There are types of games, like there are games that I just, for what the mechanics of the game put me off. I can't get into them. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. There's everyone I mean, that's a completely valid thing. There are strong design decisions that they made in this game, but strong is in the same way that like odors can be strong, either good or bad. That also applies for this edition. But if I've missed anything and isn't addressed in chat and it isn't addressed in the comments down below, please do not hesitate to leave a comment in the comment section of the video, and I will endeavor to reply in a timely fashion. You can also reach me on Twitter at Dungeon Musings, and you can reach me by email. My email address is dungeonmusings@gmail.com. If all of this sounds interesting, but you're not quite sold yet and you do want to see it in play, I didn't do it when I started streaming, but I will add that as soon as I get off. A link to our 4-part adventure that was part of our ongoing Night Below campaign, playing AD&D second, and I did my best to incorporate as much of the stuff I've talked about here, the things that I think make 4th edition cool, skill challenges, minions, solo monsters, regular monsters, all that kind of stuff. Interesting character, designs. All that stuff is on display in that, and you can see how my players reacted to that. Both, I had a mix of people who were 4th edition veterans and newbies who had never played an edition beyond 3rd. They played 5th, but they haven't played beyond 3rd. So, in addition, if you enjoyed this, I will be at the time of recording is like I said, it's Christmas Eve. And I plan on getting caught up on a couple of other things. I've got some other interesting overviews that I have to get out, or things I think might be of interest. And if you enjoyed this, you can also find there's a playlist with this one as well. You can find all my overviews for other games like Shadow of the Demon Lord, like Pathfinder 2nd Edition, like AD&D 2nd Edition. You can also click on subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified when we go live. I often don't post this as the schedules because I kind of record these when I can find the necessary chunk of time to record it. So there is a schedule, though, of our actual plays posted on the community tab of the Dungeon Musings YouTube channel. I also post them to the Dungeon Musings Discord, the schedule, and to Twitter. And if you want to join us on the Dungeon Musings Discord to talk about 4th edition or any other games, or you want to find a group to play with, or you just want to chat with some really cool people, you can find a link to the Dungeon Musings Discord in the description of the video, and you are more than welcome to join us over there. With that, I think I will bring this to a close. I hope that I've given you a effective overview of our good sense of what the game is about, how it differs from other versions of D&D, and at least help you make a decision as to whether you might want to take the dive into it. And if you're just revisiting this because you're a fellow, old lover of 4th edition, well, thanks for sitting through all this. I hope you've enjoyed this tour through the edition as much as I enjoyed preparing this and going through it. If you are joining us during the current pandemic, I do hope that this finds you healthy, safe, and weathering the current crisis as well as can be expected. If you're listening contemporaneous, I hope you have wonderful holidays as best, again, as can be expected. I hope you're healthy and safe. I hope your loved ones are healthy and safe. And until we see you again, happy gaming.